Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're dealing with another sleepless night and need some background noise, or you just want to get lost in other people's wild experiences, you're in the right place. I've gathered some of the most bizarre, heartwarming, and downright unbelievable stories from the depths of Reddit tonight. These are the kind of real-life moments that make you question reality, laugh out loud at 3 in the morning, or just shake your head wondering how people end up in these situations. So grab your favourite blanket, dim those lights, and get comfortable because we're diving deep into the strange corners of human experience. I accidentally matched with my teacher on a dating app. Neither of us swiped on purpose, but it was still beyond awkward the next day in class. I'm 19, and in my sophomore year of college, I was mindlessly swiping through profiles on this dating app around midnight, probably half asleep and not really paying attention to who I was looking at. You know how it is when you're just going through the motions, right swipe, left swipe, whatever. I wasn't even being particularly selective, just kind of zoning out after a long day of studying. The next morning, I wake up to a notification that I had a new match. Cool, nothing unusual there. But when I opened the app to check it out, my blood ran completely cold. The profile photo staring back at me was Professor Martinez, my environmental science teacher. Not someone who looked like her, not a similar person, but definitely, unmistakably, my actual professor. Same distinctive curly hair, same glasses, same smile I'd seen every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 months. My first thought was panic, pure absolute panic. How did this even happen? I tried to remember my swiping from the night before, but it was all a blur of faces and profiles. I must have accidentally swiped right on her without really looking, but that meant she had to have swiped right on me too, right? Unless there was some kind of glitch in the app or something. I spent the entire morning debating whether I should message her to explain it was an accident, or if I should just unmatch immediately and pretend it never happened. Both options felt equally mortifying. What do you even say in that situation? Sorry, Professor. Didn't mean to indicate romantic interest in you through a dating platform. Please don't let this affect my grade. The real test came during class that afternoon. I walked into the lecture hall and immediately made eye contact with Professor Martinez. For just a split second, I saw her eyes widen slightly before she quickly looked away and started shuffling through her papers. I could feel my face burning red as I took my usual seat in the 3rd row. The entire class was torture. Every time she looked in my direction during the lecture, I wondered if she was thinking about the match. When she asked if anyone had questions about the assignment, I kept my hand firmly planted on my desk, even though I actually did have a question. I couldn't risk any additional interaction beyond what was absolutely necessary. About halfway through class, she was talking about ecosystem balance or something, and she stumbled over her words slightly while looking directly at me. She recovered quickly, but I knew we were both thinking about the elephant in the room. The whole situation was so incredibly awkward that I could barely focus on anything she was saying. After class, I practically sprinted out of there. But as I was walking across campus, I heard footsteps behind me, and then Professor Martinez calling my name. My heart basically stopped. I turned around and she approached me with this expression that was part embarrassment, part amusement. She said, "I think we need to address what happened." I started stammering some explanation about how it was completely accidental, and I wasn't paying attention when I was swiping. She held up her hand and said, "Same here. I was actually showing my sister how these apps work because she's recently divorced. I must have accidentally swiped while I was demonstrating." The relief I felt was incredible. We both started laughing because the whole situation was so ridiculous. She assured me it wouldn't affect anything in class and suggested we both just unmatch and forget it ever happened. Which we did, immediately, while standing right there on the sidewalk. The rest of the semester was actually fine. We both managed to act completely normal during class, though I'll admit there were a few moments where we'd accidentally make eye contact, and I could see her trying not to smile. She turned out to be one of my favourite professors, and I ended up doing really well in her class. The funny thing is, a few months later during finals week, she mentioned to the whole class that she'd gotten engaged to someone she met through friends. I was genuinely happy for her, but I couldn't help but think about our brief, accidental digital encounter. Sometimes the most embarrassing moments turn into the best stories later. That story is over. The cosmic humour of modern dating apps strikes again. Nothing quite like accidentally indicating romantic interest in someone who literally holds your academic future in their hands. At least they both had good senses of humour about it. Speaking of unexpected encounters, this next story takes us back to childhood connections that resurface in the most surprising ways. My childhood pen pal showed up at my job 15 years later. We hadn't spoken since middle school, and suddenly they were standing at my counter. I work as a barista at this small coffee shop downtown. It's one of those cosy places with exposed brick walls and local art hanging everywhere. Most days are pretty routine. Same regular customers, same orders, nothing too exciting. Last Tuesday started like any other day. The morning rush had died down, and I was wiping down the espresso machine when someone walked up to the counter. I looked up with my standard customer service smile and froze. Standing in front of me was someone I hadn't seen or thought about in over a decade. It was Bella Chen, my pen pal from when I was in 6th grade. Our classes had been paired with a school in another state for this cultural exchange project. We were supposed to write letters back and forth to learn about different communities. Most kids did the bare minimum, but Bella and I actually became friends through our letters. We wrote to each other for almost 3 years. I still remember her distinctive handwriting and how she'd always draw little doodles in the margins of her letters. She told me about her life in Oregon, her pet hamster named Pickles, her obsession with astronomy, and her dreams of becoming a marine biologist. I shared stories about my small town, my annoying little brother, and my terrible attempts at learning guitar. The letters stopped abruptly when we both started high school. New schools, new friends, new priorities. We talked about maybe staying in touch through email, but it never happened. That's just how these childhood friendships fade sometimes. But now, 15 years later, here she was, standing in my coffee shop, looking exactly like I'd imagined adult Bella would look. Still had those same kind eyes behind trendy glasses. Still had that slightly crooked smile I remembered from the one photo she'd sent me back in 8th grade. I must have been staring because she tilted her head and said, "Are you okay?" I realised I hadn't said anything for probably 30 seconds. I managed to stammer out, "Bella? Bella Chen from Oregon?" Her face lit up with recognition and she practically shouted my name. The few other customers in the shop turned to look at us, but I didn't care. She started laughing and said she couldn't believe it was really me. Apparently she'd moved to the city 6 months ago for a job at the aquarium. She was finally living her marine biologist dream. She said she'd been walking by the coffee shop for weeks on her way to work, but had never come in until today. Something about the smell of coffee finally convinced her to stop. She had no idea I worked there, obviously. What are the odds? We spent the next 20 minutes catching up while I made her order. A lavender latte with oat milk. She told me about college, graduate school, her research on coral reef restoration. I told her about my path through community college, my brief stint trying to be a musician, and how I'd ended up genuinely loving the coffee industry. The weirdest part was how easy it felt to talk to her. 15 years had passed. We'd both become completely different people, but something about our connection felt exactly the same. She still had that same enthusiasm when talking about things she cared about. She still made the same facial expressions I remembered from trying to picture her while reading her letters. My manager had to remind me there were other customers waiting, so we exchanged phone numbers. She promised to come back the next day, and she did. In fact, she's become one of our regulars now. She stops by almost every morning before work, and we've started hanging out outside of the coffee shop too. It's amazing how some friendships can just pick up where they left off, even after all those years and all those changes. Last weekend we went to the planetarium together, and she told me she still remembers every constellation I described in my letters from those summer nights when I'd sneak out to stargaze. She brought me a box last week with all the letters I'd sent her over the years. She'd kept every single one. I'd completely forgotten about most of the things I'd written, but reading them brought back so many memories. It was like getting a window into who I used to be, seen through the eyes of someone who genuinely cared about my 12-year-old thoughts and dreams. That story is over. Sometimes the universe has perfect timing. 15 years later, and their childhood friendship just picked up like no time had passed at all. It makes you wonder about all the connections we've lost track of over the years. Our next story takes us into the realm of mysterious discoveries that make you question everything about the place you call home. I found a hidden door in my apartment closet. It led to a small crawl space with old furniture and a pair of shoes that weren't mine. I've been living in this studio apartment for about 8 months now. It's in an older building, probably from the 1940s, with those thick walls and weird angles that come with vintage architecture. The rent was reasonable and the location was perfect, so I didn't ask too many questions when I signed the lease. The closet in my bedroom has always been a little weird. It's deeper than it should be for such a small apartment, and there's this strange gap between where the back wall is and where it should be based on the layout of the building. I'd noticed it before, but never really investigated. I just figured old buildings have quirky designs. Last weekend I was doing some deep cleaning and decided to finally organise that closet properly. I was moving boxes around when I noticed something odd about the back wall. There was a section that looked different from the rest, like it had been painted over but the texture was off. When I knocked on it, it sounded hollow. I got curious and started feeling around the edges. That's when I found it, a small section that was actually a panel, not part of the permanent wall. It took some effort, but I managed to pry it open. Behind it was a narrow opening, maybe 2 feet wide and about 4 feet tall. Just big enough for a person to crawl through if they really wanted to. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The opening led to a cramped crawl space that ran along what must be the back of several apartments. It was dusty and dark, clearly hadn't been accessed in years. But it wasn't empty. There was a collection of old furniture pushed against one wall, a wooden chair with a broken leg, a small table with water damage, what looked like part of an old bed frame. Everything was covered in dust and looked like it had been there for decades. But that wasn't the strangest part. Sitting on top of the old table was a pair of women's shoes. They were vintage style, probably from the 1960s, with a small heel and a strap across the foot. They were in surprisingly good condition, considering everything else in the space was falling apart, like someone had placed them there carefully and recently. Next to the shoes was an old leather handbag, also in much better condition than it should have been. Inside the bag was a lipstick, a small mirror, and a folded piece of paper with what looked like an address written in faded ink. Not my address, but somewhere else in the city. I took photos of everything before I touched anything, just in case. The whole situation felt like something out of a mystery novel. Who had access to this space? Why were these personal items here? How long had they been there? I brought everything out of the crawl space and into my apartment to examine it better. The shoes were a size 7, which is close to my size but not exact. The style suggested they were vintage, but they looked almost new. The leather wasn't cracked, the soles weren't worn down. Either they were very well preserved or they hadn't been there as long as everything else. The address in the handbag led me down a rabbit hole of internet research. It corresponded to a building about 15 minutes away that had been demolished in the 1980s to make way for a parking lot. So whoever wrote that address down had done it at least 40 years ago. I decided to ask my landlord about the crawl space. He seemed genuinely surprised when I described it and said he'd never known it existed. The building had changed hands several times over the decades, and he'd only owned it for about 5 years. He said the previous owner hadn't mentioned any hidden spaces or storage areas. He came over to look at what I'd found and was just as puzzled as I was. He took photos for his records and said I could keep anything I'd found if I wanted to, He also said he'd have someone come seal up the opening since it wasn't supposed to be accessible anyway. Before they sealed it up, I went back in one more time with a better flashlight to make sure I hadn't missed anything. That's when I found something else. Scratched into the wooden beam near where I'd found the shoes was a name and a date. Margaret, 1967. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been carved with something small and not very sharp. I still have the shoes and the handbag. I've thought about trying to research who Margaret might have been, but I'm not sure I want to know. Sometimes mysteries are better left unsolved. Every time I look at those shoes, though, I wonder about the person who wore them and why they ended up hidden away in a secret space behind my closet. That story is over. Some discoveries are better left uninvestigated, but you know, the curiosity would eat you alive. The idea of someone named Margaret hiding personal belongings in a secret space over 50 years ago creates more questions than answers. Who was she running from, or what was she trying to preserve? Let's shift gears to a different kind of mystery, one involving digital deception and the complications of modern friendship. My friend pretended to be me online and got caught. They made a fake account using my photos and ended up messaging mutual friends. I first found out about this whole situation when my friend Riley sent me a screenshot with a confused message asking if I'd started using a different social media account. The screenshot showed a profile that was definitely using my photos, but with a slightly different version of my name and a bio I'd never written. My stomach dropped when I saw it. Someone had taken pictures from my Instagram and Facebook accounts and created this whole fake profile. But it wasn't just some random stranger trying to catfish people. The person behind it had intimate knowledge of my life, my interests, even inside jokes that only my close friends would know. I started doing some detective work, looking at who this fake account was following and who was following it back. Most of the connections were people I knew in real life, friends from college, co-workers, even some family members. Whoever was running this account was systematically connecting with my actual social circle. The bio was what really threw me off. It mentioned hobbies I'd never talked about publicly, places I'd supposedly travelled that I'd only mentioned in private conversations, even career aspirations I'd only shared with a few close friends. This wasn't just someone using my photos to create a random fake identity. This was someone trying to be a better version of me. I started reaching out to mutual friends who were connected to the fake account to ask what kind of interactions they'd had with it. That's when the full scope of the situation became clear. The fake me had been having conversations with my friends for weeks, maybe months. Deep conversations about personal stuff, offering advice and support, even making plans to meet up. My friend Zoe told me that the fake account had been messaging her regularly about her relationship problems, giving really thoughtful advice and being incredibly supportive during a difficult breakup. She said she'd been surprised by how insightful and emotionally available I'd suddenly become online, since that wasn't usually my communication style on social media. Another friend, Connor, said the fake me had been discussing philosophy and politics with him, taking positions on issues that were actually pretty different from my real opinions. The fake me was apparently more outgoing, more intellectual, more emotionally open than the real me had ever been online. The breaking point came when the fake account tried to organise a group hangout. Several of my friends started comparing notes about this event they'd all been invited to by me, except I'd never heard about it. That's when they started realising something was wrong and comparing screenshots of conversations. My friend Mira was the one who figured it out. She'd been suspicious because the fake me had mentioned a movie we'd supposedly watched together, except we'd never actually watched that movie. When she started looking more carefully at the profile, she noticed little inconsistencies in the photos and the timeline of posts. Once everyone started comparing notes, it became obvious that someone was impersonating me. But the question remained, who? The level of personal detail suggested it was someone who knew me really well, someone who had access to my private social media posts, who knew about conversations I'd had with different friends, who understood my personality well enough to create a more confident version of it. I made a list of people who could have had access to that much personal information about me. It was a short list, maybe 5 or 6 people who I trusted enough to share personal details with regularly. I started having awkward conversations with each of them, trying to figure out if they'd noticed anything strange or if they had any theories about who might be behind the fake account. The truth came out when I confronted my friend Leo about it directly. I'd noticed that he always seemed to know details about conversations I'd had with mutual friends, even when I hadn't told him about them myself. When I showed him the fake profile and asked if he had any ideas who might be behind it, his face went completely red. He broke down and admitted he'd been running the fake account for about 4 months. He said it started as a weird experiment because he was curious about how people would react to a more extroverted version of me. He'd been struggling with social anxiety and was fascinated by how easily he could connect with people when he was pretending to be someone else. He said he never meant for it to go as far as it did. At first, he was just posting occasionally and seeing how people responded. But then people started reaching out for real conversations and advice, and he found himself getting deeper into these relationships. He said it felt good to be helpful and supportive, even if he was doing it under false pretenses. The most messed up part was that he'd been using these conversations to get closer to our mutual friends in real life. He'd bring up topics or offer support based on things they'd told the fake me, creating this weird dynamic where he knew intimate details about their lives that they'd never actually shared with him directly. I told him he had to come clean to everyone he'd been talking to and delete the fake account immediately. Some of our friends were understanding once they learned about his social anxiety struggles, but others felt really violated by the whole situation. A few people ended their friendships with him over it. The weirdest part for me was realizing that the fake version of me had actually built stronger relationships with some of our friends than I had managed to build myself. Several people mentioned missing the deep conversations they'd had with fake me and suggested I should try being more open and emotionally available in my real online interactions. That story is over. The psychological complexity of creating a fake version of someone you know personally is honestly disturbing. Using your friend's identity to become more socially successful while mining their private information is a level of betrayal that's hard to come back from. It makes you wonder how well we really know the people closest to us. Our next story takes us to an unexpected role in someone else's special moment that you definitely didn't sign up for. I accidentally ended up in someone's family photo shoot. I was just at the park, but somehow I was standing right in the background of every shot. Last Saturday was one of those perfect autumn afternoons where the light hits everything just right and the leaves are at peak colour. I decided to take my book to Riverside Park and find a quiet spot under one of the big oak trees to read for a few hours. I found this perfect spot near the pond where there was good shade and a clear view of the water. I spread out my blanket and settled in with my coffee and this novel I'd been trying to finish for weeks. The park was busier than usual, but I found a relatively peaceful area away from the main walking paths. About 20 minutes into reading, I noticed this family setting up what looked like a professional photo session nearby. There was a photographer with multiple cameras and a big reflector thing, plus this family of about 8 people, ranging from grandparents down to toddlers. They were all dressed in coordinating fall colours, you know, the whole matching but not identical thing that families do for these kinds of photos. I didn't think much of it at first. Family photos are pretty common in the park, especially during fall when everything looks like a postcard. I figured they'd do their thing and I'd continue reading. I made sure to stay out of their way and kept to my little corner under the oak tree. But then I started noticing the photographer kept having to pause and reposition people. At first I thought maybe someone wasn't cooperating or the lighting wasn't right. Then I realised they were trying to work around me in the background of their shots. Every time they'd get everyone positioned, I'd apparently be visible somewhere behind them. The photographer was being really polite about it, never directly asking me to move, just constantly adjusting angles and having the family shift positions. But I could tell I was becoming a problem. The thing is, I was there first and I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just quietly reading my book in a public park. After about the fourth repositioning, I looked up and made eye contact with the photographer. She gave me this apologetic smile, and I realised they were basically having to choreograph their entire session around my presence under this tree. I started to get up to move, but the grandmother in the group waved at me and called out, "Oh honey, don't worry about it, you stay put." That's when things got weird. Instead of continuing to work around me, the photographer suddenly had an idea. She asked if I minded being in some of the more casual shots as like background atmosphere. She said it would make the photos feel more natural and lived in, whatever that means. I was confused but figured why not. I went back to reading my book while they took several shots with me, just naturally doing my thing in the background. The photographer seemed really excited about how it was looking and kept saying things like "perfect, that's so organic, and the composition is beautiful." Then the family started getting into it. The kids thought it was hilarious that there was a random person in their family photos. The parents started joking about how they'd have to explain to relatives who the mystery person in the corner was. The grandfather suggested they should ask me to be in every family photo from now on, as their official background person. Before I knew it, they were actually posing me into some of the shots. Nothing formal, just having me sit naturally with my book while they arranged themselves around the area. The photographer was treating me like part of the composition, adjusting my position and making sure the lighting worked for everyone. The weirdest part was how comfortable it all became. This family I'd never met before was including me in their photo session, like I belonged there. The kids started asking me about my book. The mum offered me some of the snacks they'd brought. It turned into this strange but pleasant social situation. We spent about 2 hours together, taking photos all around that section of the park. I ended up being in probably half of their family pictures, sometimes just reading in the background, sometimes actually interacting with family members who would come sit near me or ask me questions for more candid shots. At the end, the photographer asked for my contact information so she could send me copies of the photos I was in. The family insisted on it, saying I was now part of their family photo collection and deserved copies. They also invited me to join them for ice cream afterward, which felt surreal but really sweet. The mum texted me a few days later with a link to an online gallery of all the photos. Seeing myself woven throughout this family's photo session was bizarre but kind of wonderful. I looked like I belonged there, like I was the bookish cousin or family friend who'd always been part of their group. They ended up using one of the photos with me in it for their Christmas card. I'm sitting under the tree reading while the family's arranged around the pond behind me. They said it captured the feeling of the day perfectly and that I'd made their photo session more memorable than any traditional family portrait could have been. That story's over. Sometimes the best memories happen when you're not trying to create them. The fact that this accidental photobomb turned into a whole family bonding experience is honestly heartwarming. Makes you wonder how many interesting connections we miss by staying in our own bubbles. Moving on to a transportation tale that took an unexpected detour into someone else's celebration. My Uber driver took me to his own birthday party first. He said it would only take a minute and invited me inside before finishing the ride. I was heading home from the airport last month after a work trip that had been absolutely exhausting. 3 days of back-to-back meetings, hotel coffee, and airplane food had left me completely drained. All I wanted was to get home, order some real food, and collapse on my couch. I called an Uber from the arrival's pickup area and was relieved when the driver, Miguel, showed up quickly in a clean car with good music playing. He was friendly, but not overly chatty, which was perfect for my mood. He confirmed my address, and we started heading toward my neighbourhood. About 10 minutes into the ride, Miguel's phone started buzzing with text messages. He apologised and asked if I minded if he checked them quickly at the next red light. I told him no problem, assuming it was probably dispatch or another passenger. But when he looked at his phone, his whole face lit up with this huge smile. He turned around and explained that today was his birthday and his family had been texting him about a surprise party they'd organised at his sister's house. He said they'd been planning it for weeks and everyone was already there waiting for him. The problem was, his sister lived about 15 minutes in the opposite direction from where we were headed. I could see the conflict on his face. He clearly wanted to go see his family, but he also had a job to do and a passenger to deliver. I told him we could figure something out. Maybe I could catch another ride from wherever his sister lived. But he shook his head and said that wouldn't be fair to me. Then he had this idea. His sister's house was actually not too far from a main road that would get us back on track to my place. He asked if I'd mind making a quick detour, so he could just pop in and say hello to everyone, grab a piece of cake, and then continue with my ride. He promised it would only take 5 minutes. I was tired, but the guy seemed so genuinely excited about seeing his family that I couldn't say no. Plus, how often do you accidentally get invited to someone's birthday party? I told him sure, as long as it really was quick, because I was exhausted and just wanted to get home. When we pulled up to his sister's house, there were cars parked everywhere, and I could hear music and laughter coming from the backyard. Miguel practically bounced out of the driver's seat and asked if I wanted to come in for a minute instead of waiting in the car. He said his family would love to meet me, and there was definitely plenty of food. I hesitated because I was still in my travel clothes and probably looked terrible after 3 days of business meetings, but something about Miguel's enthusiasm was infectious, and honestly, the idea of real homemade food was pretty tempting after days of airport snacks. The moment we walked through the front door, I was hit with the most amazing smells of grilled meat and fresh tortillas. Miguel's sister Elena came running over and immediately pulled me into a hug like I was a long-lost relative. Before I could explain that I was just his passenger, she was handing me a plate of food and introducing me to what felt like 50 family members. Miguel disappeared into the crowd of relatives, and I found myself standing in their kitchen, holding a plate of the best-smelling carnitas I'd ever encountered. His niece, who couldn't have been more than 8, appointed herself as my tour guide and started explaining who everyone was and how they were related to Miguel. The 5-minute stop turned into almost an hour. Miguel kept apologizing and saying we could leave any time, but honestly, I was having more fun than I'd had all week. His family was incredibly welcoming, the food was amazing, and there was something really joyful about celebrating someone's birthday with people who clearly loved him so much. His mum insisted on sending me home with leftovers. His dad showed me photos of Miguel as a kid and told stories about his first car. His teenage nephew challenged me to a game of pool in their garage, which I lost spectacularly, but enjoyed anyway. I felt more relaxed and happy than I had in months. When we finally got back in the car to finish my ride, Miguel was glowing with happiness. He kept thanking me for being cool about the detour and said his family had loved meeting me. He refused to let me pay for the ride, saying that anyone who celebrated his birthday with his family deserved a free trip home. He also gave me Elena's number and said I was invited to their next family barbecue if I wanted to come. I actually ended up going a few weeks later and had another amazing time. Miguel and I became genuine friends after that, and his family basically adopted me as an honorary member. Otherwise, that story is over. Sometimes the best adventures happen when you're flexible with your plans. Miguel's spontaneous birthday party detour turned into a friendship and a whole extended family connection. It's a good reminder that saying yes to unexpected invitations can lead to the most meaningful experiences. Our next story brings us to an accidental treasure hunt with more mystery than reward. I found a lottery ticket in a library book. It wasn't a winner, but it made me wonder about the person who left it there. I spend a lot of time at the downtown branch of our public library. It's one of those beautiful, old Carnegie libraries with high ceilings and huge windows that let in perfect reading light. I go there at least twice a week to work on my thesis and escape my noisy apartment. Last Tuesday I was browsing the fiction section, looking for something light to read as a break from academic writing. I pulled out this worn copy of a mystery novel from the 1980s, something with a dramatic cover featuring shadows and a magnifying glass. The book looked like it had been well loved, with creased pages and that soft feel that paperbacks get after being handled by dozens of people. When I opened it to check the publication date, something fluttered out and landed on the floor. At first, I thought it was just a bookmark or a receipt someone had left behind. But when I picked it up, I realised it was a lottery ticket from about 6 months ago. The ticket was for one of those daily number games where you pick a few digits and hope they match what gets drawn. Someone had carefully filled out the numbers in blue pen, choosing what looks like a combination of dates. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, like whoever bought it had put thought into their number selection. My first instinct was to check if it was a winner. I pulled out my phone and looked up the winning numbers for that date. I felt this little flutter of excitement, like maybe I'd stumbled onto someone's forgotten fortune. But when I compared the numbers, it wasn't even close, not a single digit matched. That's when I started wondering about the person who'd bought this ticket and then used it as a bookmark. Who were they? Why did they choose those particular numbers? Were they dates that meant something special to them? A birthday, an anniversary, the day they got married or had a kid? I looked more closely at the book where I'd found the ticket. It was a detective novel about a woman who inherits a house and discovers mysterious clues left by the previous owner. Someone had made notes in the margins, little observations about the plot and theories about who the villain might be. The handwriting matched what was on the lottery ticket. The margin notes were fascinating. Whoever had been reading this book was really engaged with the story, predicting plot twists and connecting clues. They'd written things like, "The neighbour knows more than she's saying," and "Check chapter 3 for the key detail." It was like following someone else's thought process as they worked through the mystery. I found myself getting invested in both stories, the fictional mystery in the book and the real mystery of who had been reading it. The lottery ticket felt like a clue in itself, someone who played the lottery regularly, someone who used tickets as bookmarks, someone who read mystery novels and took notes while they read. At the back of the book, I found more evidence of the previous reader. They'd written a list of all the characters and their relationships to each other, like they were keeping track of a complex family tree. There was also a timeline of events from the story, carefully organised by chapter and page number. This person was clearly a thoughtful, organised reader who approached books like puzzles to be solved. The lottery ticket suggested they were also someone who believed in luck, or at least enjoyed the possibility of it. Maybe they bought a ticket every week and used the old ones as bookmarks until they accumulated enough to throw away. I decided to keep both the book and the lottery ticket. I checked the book out officially and took it home to finish reading. As I read, I found myself comparing my theories about the mystery to the notes in the margins. Sometimes I agreed with the previous reader's observations. Sometimes I thought they'd missed important clues. By the time I finished the book, I felt like I'd had a conversation with a stranger across time. They'd guided me through the story with their notes and theories, and I'd responded with my own thoughts and interpretations. The lottery ticket had become part of the experience, a reminder that this reader was someone who took chances and hoped for good fortune. I ended up keeping the lottery ticket as a bookmark in my own books. It felt like honouring the previous reader's system while creating my own connection to their story. Every time I see those carefully chosen numbers, I think about the person who selected them and wonder what made those dates important enough to bet on. That story is over. There's something beautiful about finding traces of other people's lives in unexpected places. That lottery ticket became a window into someone else's hopes and habits, turning a simple library visit into a connection across time. Makes you wonder what small pieces of yourself you're leaving behind for others to discover. Let's move into a story about family deception that lasted far longer than anyone expected. My cousin faked an accent for 2 years straight. She convinced everyone at school she was from another country until it slipped one day. My cousin Selene moved to our town the summer before her junior year of high school. Her dad got transferred for work, and they relocated from about 3 states away. It was a big adjustment for everyone, leaving behind friends and starting over in a new place where they didn't know anyone. When school started in the fall, I was excited to finally have family at the same school. Celine and I had always gotten along well during family gatherings, and I thought it would be cool to hang out more and help her meet people. But on her first day, something really strange happened. I was walking down the hallway between classes when I heard this voice that sounded familiar, but different. I turned around and saw Selena talking to a group of students near the lockers, but she was speaking with this accent I'd never heard from her before. It sounded vaguely European, maybe British or Australian, but not quite either one. She was introducing herself to these kids and telling them about how difficult it was adjusting to American high school after growing up overseas. She mentioned something about her father's work requiring them to move around internationally, and how she'd spent the last few years in boarding schools abroad. I stood there completely confused, listening to my cousin spin this elaborate story about her international background, while speaking in an accent that definitely wasn't real. When she saw me watching, she gave me this look that clearly meant don't say anything. I was too shocked to react anyway. Later that day, I caught up with her at lunch and asked what the hell was going on. She pulled me aside and explained that she'd decided to reinvent herself for this new school. She said she'd always felt boring and ordinary, and moving to a new place was her chance to be someone more interesting. She'd spent weeks practicing the accent and developing this backstory about growing up overseas. She said it made her feel more confident and sophisticated, and she liked the attention it brought her. She begged me not to blow her cover, promising it was just temporary, until she made some friends and felt more settled. I thought it was a terrible idea and told her she was going to get caught eventually. But Celine was determined to stick with it. She said she'd done research on international schools and different countries so she could answer questions authentically. She had this whole fictional life mapped out in detail. The crazy thing is, it worked. Within a few weeks, Celine had become one of the most popular kids in her grade. Everyone was fascinated by her stories about living in different countries and experiencing all these exotic places. Teachers loved her supposed international perspective on literature and history classes. She started dating this guy who was completely enchanted by her worldly background. She'd tell him stories about summers in the countryside of whatever country she was claiming to be from that week. She kept a journal with notes about her fictional past so she could keep her stories straight. I watched this whole performance for months, constantly expecting someone to call her out or catch her in a contradiction. But Selene was incredibly committed to the character she'd created. She watched foreign films to pick up mannerisms, studied maps so she could describe places in detail, even changed her fashion sense to match what she thought someone from her fictional background would wear. The accent became so natural that sometimes I wondered if she'd forgotten it was fake. She used it at home when she was on the phone with school friends, and I'd catch her slipping into it during family dinners when she was telling stories about her day. Her parents knew something was different about how she talked at school, but they attributed it to typical teenage experimentation with identity. They had no idea she'd constructed this entire false persona around being from another country. The whole thing came crashing down during our senior year. Celine was giving a presentation in her AP history class about cultural differences in education systems. She was deep into character, talking about her experiences in international schools, when she made a reference to something that happened back home in Indiana. The classroom went dead silent. Her teacher asked her to repeat what she'd said, and you could see the panic in Selena's eyes as she realized what had slipped out. She tried to recover by claiming she meant Indiana was like a second home or something, but it was too late. The spell was broken. Words spread through the school within hours. People started putting together inconsistencies they'd noticed over the past 2 years. Her boyfriend felt completely betrayed and broke up with her immediately. Some of her friends thought it was hilarious, but Others felt manipulated and lied to. The aftermath was brutal. Celine went from being one of the most popular kids to being known as the girl who faked being foreign for 2 years. She was embarrassed and had to face all these people who felt like they'd been deceived by someone they trusted. But weirdly, some people respected the commitment and creativity it had taken to maintain such an elaborate performance for so long. A few teachers actually gave her credit for the research and preparation she'd put into creating her fictional background. The drama teacher even asked if she'd considered pursuing acting seriously. Selena dropped the accent immediately and spent the rest of senior year just being herself, which turned out to be pretty interesting without the fake international mystique. She learned that she didn't need an elaborate persona to be likable, but it took a long time to rebuild trust with people who'd felt deceived. That story is over. 2 years of commitment to a fake identity is honestly impressive from a performance standpoint, even if it was built on lies. The dedication required to maintain that level of deception while living with family who knew the truth must have been exhausting. Sometimes, the most interesting thing about someone is just who they actually are. Our next story involves a case of mistaken contact information that led to some very awkward phone calls. My friend accidentally put my phone number on their resume. I started getting job interview calls for weeks before we figured it out. I work from home doing freelance graphic design, which means my phone is usually on silent during the day unless I'm expecting a specific call. Most of my clients communicate through email or project management platforms, so phone calls are pretty rare in my daily routine. About 3 weeks ago, I started getting these random phone calls at odd hours. The first few I just ignored because I didn't recognize the numbers and figured they were probably spam calls or telemarketers, but they kept coming, sometimes 2 or 3 calls in a single afternoon. Finally, curiosity got the better of me and I answered one of them. The woman on the other end sounded very professional and started by saying, "Hi, this is Patricia from Morrison & Associates. We received your resume for the marketing coordinator position and would like to schedule a phone interview." Yes. I was completely confused. I told her I hadn't applied for any marketing jobs and definitely hadn't sent a resume to her company. She seemed just as confused as I was and asked me to verify the phone number she'd called. When she read it back to me, it was definitely my number. She said they'd received a resume from someone named Hugo Martinez about a week earlier, and this was the contact number listed. I told her I didn't know anyone named Hugo Martinez, but she insisted the resume had been submitted with my phone number as the primary contact. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. Different companies, different positions, but always the same story. They'd received a resume from Hugo Martinez with my phone number listed. I was getting calls for everything from entry-level administrative positions to senior management roles in industries I knew nothing about. Some of the conversations were pretty awkward because the hiring managers would start asking me technical questions about experience I didn't have. I'd have to explain that there had been some kind of mix-up and that they needed to contact Hugo directly. But of course they didn't have any other way to reach him, since my number was the only contact information provided. The calls started coming at all hours too. Early morning calls from East Coast companies, late evening calls from West Coast firms, even a few international calls from companies that apparently had offices overseas. My phone was constantly buzzing with unknown numbers. I started keeping a list of all the companies that called, thinking maybe I could figure out some pattern or track down this Hugo person somehow. But the jobs were all over the place, geographically and professionally. Tech companies in Silicon Valley, accounting firms in Chicago, non-profit organizations in Portland, consulting groups in Boston. After about 10 days of this, I was getting pretty frustrated. I'd had to turn my phone back on during work hours because I was worried I might miss an important call from an actual client, but that meant getting interrupted constantly by these job interview requests. Then I got a call from a company called Stellar Marketing Solutions. The hiring manager, Kevin, was particularly persistent and said they were really excited about Hugo's background and wanted to set up an in-person interview as soon as possible. He mentioned that Hugo's cover letter had mentioned relocating to the area specifically for this opportunity. That's when I had an idea. I told Kevin that there had been a mistake with the contact information, but I asked him if he could email me a copy of the resume so I could help track down Hugo and make sure he got connected properly. Kevin was surprisingly helpful and said he'd send it right over. When I opened the resume attachment, everything suddenly made sense. Hugo Martinez was my friend from college. We'd stayed in touch on social media, but hadn't talked in person in probably 2 years. The resume listed experience and education that I remembered him mentioning in various posts and conversations. But there at the top, clear as day, was my phone number listed as his primary contact. I compared it to his actual phone number in my contacts, and I could see what had happened. His number ended in 7823, mine ends in 7832. He'd transposed 2 digits when typing up his contact information. I called Hugo immediately and explained what had been happening. He was mortified. He said he'd been applying to jobs for the past month and couldn't understand why he wasn't hearing back from anyone. He'd been checking his email constantly and waiting by his phone, getting more and more discouraged that no one seemed interested in his applications. He'd been so focused on crafting the perfect resume and cover letters that he hadn't double-checked the contact information at the top. He'd been sending out dozens of applications with my phone number instead of his own, which explained why I'd been getting such a wide variety of calls from different industries and locations. Hugo felt terrible about the mix-up and started calling back every company I could remember to correct his contact information. Some of them were understanding and rescheduled interviews with his correct number. Others had already moved on to other candidates, figuring that a candidate who couldn't be reached wasn't serious about the position. The funny thing is, a few of the hiring managers I'd spoken to were so impressed by how polite and professional I'd been in explaining the situation that they asked if I was interested in applying for positions myself. One company even said they had openings that might be perfect for someone with my background. Hugo ended up getting 3 interviews from the corrected applications and actually landed a job with one of the companies that had originally called me. He said the hiring manager remembered our conversation and was impressed that Hugo had a friend who was responsible enough to help sort out the confusion. That story is over. The mental image of Hugo sitting by his phone wondering why no one was calling while companies were desperately trying to reach him through the wrong number is honestly pretty tragic. At least it had a happy ending and taught both of them to triple-check contact information. Let's move to something that would make anyone question their living situation and their locks. I woke up to a stranger sleeping on my couch. Turns out he was drunk and thought my apartment was his friend's place. I'm not a particularly heavy sleeper, but I'd had a long week at work and had taken some melatonin the night before to help me get a full 8 hours. I usually wake up naturally around 7 in the morning, but that Saturday I slept until almost 10, which was unusual for me. I stumbled out of my bedroom toward the kitchen to make coffee, still half asleep and not really paying attention to my surroundings. My apartment has an open floor plan, so you can see the living room from the kitchen area. As I was reaching for the coffee maker, I noticed something that made me freeze completely. There was someone sleeping on my couch. Not someone I recognized, not someone who should have been there, just a complete stranger passed out under the throw blanket. I usually keep folded on the back of the sofa. My first instinct was panic. Had someone broken in? Was I being robbed? Should I call the police? But the person didn't look threatening. He was probably in his mid-20s, wearing jeans and a college sweatshirt, and he was snoring softly, like he was having the most peaceful sleep of his life. I grabbed a kitchen knife, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I had no idea what was going on and wanted to be prepared for anything. I approached the couch slowly and cleared my throat loudly. The guy didn't even stir. I said, "Excuse me," in a normal voice, then a little louder, then practically shouted it. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked around with this confused, disoriented expression. When he saw me standing there with a knife in my hand, he sat up quickly and started apologizing immediately. He looked just as confused as I felt. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," he said, rubbing his eyes and looking around my apartment like he was trying to figure out where he was. "This isn't Tyler's place, is it?" I told him no, definitely not Tyler's place, and asked him how he'd gotten into my apartment. He explained that he'd been out drinking with friends the night before and had gotten separated from the group around 2 in the morning. His friend Tyler lived in the same apartment complex and had given him a spare key in case he ever needed a place to crash. He'd been trying to find Tyler's apartment in the dark and apparently picked the wrong door. The weird thing was, his key had actually worked in my lock. He showed me the key, and it looked identical to mine, except for a slight difference in one of the teeth. Apparently, some of the older locks in the building weren't very secure, and similar keys could sometimes work in multiple units. He was incredibly apologetic and embarrassed about the whole situation. He said he'd been so drunk that he hadn't really looked around when he came in, just headed straight for what he thought was Tyler's couch, and passed out immediately. He'd had no idea he was in the wrong apartment until he woke up to me standing over him. I put the knife away once I realised he wasn't a threat, just a very lost and hungover college student who'd made an honest mistake. He kept apologising and asking if he could call someone to come pick him up. He said Tyler lived 2 floors up and that he'd obviously gotten confused about which stairwell to use. The whole situation was so bizarre that I almost started laughing. Here was this complete stranger who'd accidentally spent the night on my couch, and he seemed more mortified about it than I was. He offered to pay for professional cleaning of the couch cushions or replace anything he might have damaged, even though he'd literally just slept there. I made him a cup of coffee and let him call Tyler, who came down immediately to collect his very embarrassed friend. Tyler was also incredibly apologetic and explained that he'd given out spare keys to a few close friends, but hadn't thought about the possibility of them ending up in the wrong apartment. Tyler insisted on paying for me to get my locks changed, which seemed like overkill but was probably a good idea anyway. The maintenance guy who came to install the new lock said it wasn't uncommon in older buildings for keys to be similar enough to work in multiple units, especially if people weren't careful about getting their locks rekeyed regularly. The hungover couch sleeper, whose name turned out to be Marcus, sent me a handwritten apology note a few days later, along with a gift card to a local coffee shop. He said he'd never been so embarrassed in his life, and that he'd learned his lesson about drinking too much and trying to navigate unfamiliar buildings in the dark. Tyler and I actually became friends after that. He lives just 2 floors up, and we'd run into each other in the hallway occasionally. He'd always ask how my new locks were working, and joke about making sure Marcus knew exactly which apartment was his before giving him any more spare keys. The whole experience made me realise how vulnerable I'd been living in that apartment with such basic security. I ended up getting a deadbolt installed in addition to the new regular lock, and I started being more careful about things like keeping my blinds closed at night and not leaving windows open when I wasn't home. That story is over. Waking up to find a stranger sleeping peacefully on your couch is the stuff of nightmares, but at least this one turned out to be just a very drunk navigation error. The fact that his key actually worked in the lock makes you wonder about every apartment building's security system ever. Our next story ventures into the realm of workplace mysteries that blur the line between coincidence and the supernatural. My coworker thought I was a ghost. She'd never met me before and swore she'd seen me in her dreams the night before. I work at a mid-sized insurance company downtown, the kind of place where you might not meet everyone, even after working there for months. Different departments are spread across 3 floors, and unless you have a reason to collaborate with other teams, you could easily go weeks without crossing paths with certain co-workers. I'd been working there for about 6 months when they hired someone new for the claims processing department on the 2nd floor. I work in underwriting on the 3rd floor, so our paths wouldn't normally cross except maybe in the elevator or the break room. I didn't think much about it when I heard through office gossip that they'd brought someone new onto Linda's team. Last Thursday morning, I was grabbing coffee from the machine in the main break room when this woman I'd never seen before walked in. She was probably in her early 30s, had shoulder-length brown hair, and was carrying one of those reusable coffee cups with motivational quotes printed on it. She took one look at me and stopped dead in her tracks. Her face went completely pale, and she dropped her coffee cup, which thankfully was empty and didn't break. She just stood there, staring at me, like she'd seen something impossible. I asked if she was okay, thinking maybe she was having some kind of medical episode or felt faint. But instead of answering, she asked me what my name was and what department I worked in. When I told her, she got even more pale and asked if we'd ever met before. I said no, I was pretty sure I'd never seen her before either. That's when she told me the strangest thing. She said her name was Rachel and that she'd dreamed about me the night before. Not just any dream, but a very specific, detailed dream where we'd had a long conversation in what looked like our office break room. In the dream, according to Rachel, I told her about a problem I was having with a difficult client who kept calling to complain about their policy terms. I'd mentioned specific details about the client's name, their policy number, and the exact nature of their complaints. Rachel said the dream had been so vivid that she'd woken up feeling like it had actually happened. The weird part was, I actually was dealing with exactly that situation. I'd been handling this frustrating case for the past week, involving a client who called daily to argue about coverage limits and deductible amounts, but there was no way Rachel could have known about that, since we'd never met and she worked in a completely different department. I told her about the client's situation, thinking maybe she'd somehow overheard me talking to someone about it, but Rachel said she'd only started working there 3 days ago and hadn't had any contact with anyone from my department. She'd been going through orientation and training, mostly staying on the second floor. Rachel seemed genuinely disturbed by the whole thing. She said she'd never experienced anything like it before and didn't usually remember her dreams in such detail. She described other parts of the dream too, like what I was wearing and specific things I'd said about my weekend plans, stuff that she couldn't possibly have known. The conversation was getting pretty weird, so I suggested maybe she'd seen me in the elevator or hallway without consciously registering it, and her subconscious had incorporated that into a dream. But she insisted she would have remembered meeting me, and that the dream had felt more like a real conversation than anything her imagination would create. Over the next few days, Rachel kept finding excuses to come up to the third floor. She'd ask questions about office procedures that she could have easily asked her own supervisor, or she'd offer to deliver documents that could have been sent through internal mail. Every time she saw me, she'd get this slightly spooked expression. Finally, I asked her directly what was bothering her about the whole dream situation. She explained that she'd always been a little superstitious about dreams and premonitions, and that having such a detailed, accurate dream about someone she'd never met felt significant somehow. She started asking around the office to see if anyone else had ever experienced anything similar. Most people thought it was just a weird coincidence, but a few of the older employees mentioned that the building had a strange history. Apparently, it used to be a hotel back in the 1940s, and some people claimed there was residual energy or something. I don't really believe in supernatural explanations, but I couldn't come up with a rational reason for Rachel's dream to have been so accurate about my work situation. She'd described details about the client case that only I knew, including the client's habit of calling exactly at 3 p.m. every day, and their tendency to threaten to switch insurance companies. Rachel and I ended up becoming friends over the whole bizarre situation. She'd stop by my desk sometimes to check if any of her other dreams had connections to real events happening in my life. Most of the time, they didn't, but occasionally she'd mention something that would turn out to be surprisingly accurate. The client's situation that started the whole thing eventually resolved itself when the customer decided to switch to a different insurance company. Rachel joked that maybe her dream had been a premonition about how the case would end, since in the dream version, I'd mentioned feeling relieved that a difficult client was finally leaving. We still work at the same company, and Rachel still occasionally tells me about dreams she's had that seem to connect to real events. I've never had any similar experiences myself, but I've learned not to dismiss her observations entirely. Sometimes the things she dreams about turn out to be eerily accurate. That story is over. Having a coworker who claims to dream about your specific work problems before meeting you would definitely make anyone question the nature of reality. Whether it's supernatural sensitivity or just an incredibly strange coincidence, that's the kind of thing that would stick with you forever. Let's transition to a discovery that turned breakfast time into a complete mystery. I found an engagement ring hidden in my cereal box. It wasn't meant for me. My roommate had hidden it there and forgot. I'm definitely not a morning person, so my breakfast routine is pretty automatic. Same cereal, same bowl, same spot at the kitchen counter while I check my phone and try to wake up enough to function like a human being. My roommate Brian and I have lived together for about 2 years now, and we've got a pretty good system worked out. We buy our own groceries, label everything in the fridge, and generally stay out of each other's way. He's an early riser who's usually gone to work by the time I drag myself to the kitchen, so mornings are typically my quiet time. Last Monday morning, I was going through my usual routine when something felt off about my cereal box. It was my favourite brand, the kind with the granola clusters and dried fruit. But when I shook it, there was a different sound than usual. Instead of the normal rustling of cereal pieces, there was something heavier rattling around inside. I figured maybe the cereal had settled during shipping, or something had gotten broken during transport. I poured my usual bowl and noticed that, along with the cereal, something small and metallic had fallen out. At first glance, I thought it might be a piece of the cereal that had gotten burned or discoloured during manufacturing. But when I picked it out of my bowl to throw it away, I realised it was a ring. Not just any ring, but clearly an engagement ring with a decent-sized diamond that caught the morning light coming through the kitchen window. I sat there staring at it, completely confused about how an engagement ring had ended up in my breakfast cereal. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of marketing stunt or contest prize. Maybe the cereal company was doing a promotion where they hid jewellery in random boxes, and I'd gotten incredibly lucky. But there weren't any special markings on the box or announcements about contests that I could remember. Then I started wondering if Brian had somehow put it there. Maybe he was planning to propose to his girlfriend Claire and had hidden the ring in what he thought was his cereal box. But Brian bought different cereal than me, usually the boring healthy stuff with no sugar, so that didn't make sense either. I examined the ring more closely and realised it was definitely real. The diamond looked authentic. The setting was white gold or platinum, and there was an inscription inside the band that I couldn't quite make out. This wasn't some costume jewellery or promotional trinket. This was someone's actual engagement ring. I took photos of it from every angle, and then called Brian at work. When I explained what I'd found, there was this long pause before he started laughing. Not amused laughing, more like panicked, hysterical laughing, mixed with what sounded like relief and terror. Turns out Brian had bought the ring 3 weeks earlier and had been trying to find the perfect place to hide it until he was ready to propose to Claire. He'd been paranoid about her finding it accidentally, so he'd been moving it around to different hiding spots every few days. First, he'd hidden it in his sock drawer, but then worried that Claire might put away laundry and discover it. Then he'd moved it to a toolbox in the garage, but decided that was too obvious since Claire sometimes borrowed tools for art projects. He'd tried hiding it in various places around the apartment, getting more and more anxious about keeping it secret. Finally, he'd decided that a cereal box would be the perfect hiding place, since Claire never ate cereal and wouldn't have any reason to look inside. The problem was, in his nervousness about the whole proposal situation, he'd grabbed the wrong cereal box. Instead of putting it in his healthy grain cereal, he'd accidentally hidden it in my sugary cluster cereal. Brian had completely forgotten where he'd put the ring and had been quietly panicking for the past week. He'd been retracing his steps checking all his previous hiding spots, even wondering if he'd somehow lost it or if it had fallen out of his pocket somewhere. He'd been considering calling the jewellery store to see if he could buy another identical ring. He rushed home during his lunch break to retrieve the ring, looking both relieved and embarrassed about the whole mix-up. He said he'd been so stressed about planning the perfect proposal that he'd been making careless mistakes and second-guessing every decision. The proposal ended up happening that weekend at Claire's favourite restaurant. Brian told me later that he'd been so nervous about losing the ring again that he'd kept it in his pocket the entire week, checking every few minutes to make sure it was still there. Claire said yes, and when Brian told her the story about accidentally hiding the ring in my cereal, she thought it was hilarious. She said it was typical Brian to overthink something so much that he'd create more problems than he was solving. They're planning the wedding for next spring. I still eat the same cereal for breakfast, but now I always check to make sure there aren't any valuable items hidden inside before I pour it into my bowl. Brian has promised to run any future hiding places by me first to avoid similar mix-ups with expensive jewellery. That story is over. Finding an engagement ring in your morning cereal is definitely one way to wake up fast. The image of Brian frantically searching the apartment for a ring that was sitting in breakfast food the whole time is both stressful and hilarious. At least it all worked out and makes for a great proposal story. Our next tale takes us into the world of sports predictions and the fine line between luck and something more mysterious. My friend claimed they could predict the future and got one right. They joked about the exact score of a game, and it ended up happening perfectly. My friend Oliver has always been the type of person who makes bold, random predictions about everything. Sports games, weather patterns, which celebrities will get married next, what songs will be number one, anything that involves guessing about future events. Most of the time his predictions are completely wrong, but he makes them with such confidence that it's become entertaining to listen to. We were hanging out at this sports bar downtown last month, watching the playoffs with a group of friends. It was one of those nights where everyone's relaxed, the drinks are flowing, and people are getting louder and more opinionated as the evening goes on. Oliver was in peak form, making predictions about every aspect of the game we were watching. The game was between two teams that were pretty evenly matched, and most sports analysts were calling it too close to call. The betting odds were nearly even, and even the most dedicated fans weren't confident about predicting a winner. It was shaping up to be one of those games that could go either way depending on small moments and lucky breaks. About halfway through the second quarter, Oliver suddenly announced that he could see exactly how the game was going to end. Not just who would win, but the specific final score down to the exact points. He said it with this dramatic flourish, like he was channeling some kind of psychic energy. He predicted that the home team would win 28-24. He was very specific about it, even explaining how he thought the scoring would break down. He said there would be 4 touchdowns for the winning team, all in different quarters, and that the losing team would score 3 touchdowns but miss a field goal attempt in the final minutes. Everyone at our table basically ignored him because Oliver makes these kinds of specific predictions all the time, and they're usually wildly inaccurate. He'd predicted the Super Bowl score wrong by 30 points just a few months earlier. We'd learned to just nod along and continue watching the actual game instead of taking his forecast seriously. But as the game progressed, things started happening exactly like Oliver had predicted. The home team scored their first touchdown in the second quarter, just like he'd said. The visiting team answered with their own touchdown, keeping the score close. By halftime, the pattern Oliver had described was already starting to emerge. During the third quarter, people at our table started paying more attention to Oliver's prediction. The scoring continued to follow his forecast almost exactly. The home team got another touchdown early in the quarter, and the visitors responded with one of their own. The score was tracking perfectly with what he'd called. By the fourth quarter, everyone was getting genuinely freaked out. Oliver's prediction was playing out on the screen in front of us with eerie accuracy. The home team scored their third touchdown, putting them at 21 points. The visiting team got their third touchdown, bringing them to 21 as well. We were all staring at Oliver like he'd developed supernatural powers. With about 8 minutes left in the game, the home team scored their fourth touchdown, putting them at exactly 28 points, just like Oliver had predicted. The visiting team had one more chance to score, and according to Oliver's forecast, they would get a touchdown, but miss the extra field goal, ending the game at 28-24. The tension in our section of the sports bar was incredible. Other people around us had started listening to our conversation and were watching to see if Oliver's prediction would come true. Some guy from another table even came over to ask what else Oliver had predicted about the game. With 2 minutes left on the clock, the visiting team drove down the field and scored their final touchdown. The score was now 28-23, and they had to attempt the extra point kick to tie the game. According to Oliver's prediction, this kick would miss, and the game would end exactly as he'd called it. The entire bar went quiet as the kicker lined up for what should have been a routine extra point. These kicks are successful probably 99% of the time, so there was no logical reason to expect it to miss. But Oliver's prediction had been so accurate up to this point that we were all holding our breath. The kick sailed our breath, waiting to see what would happen. The kick sailed wide left. The final score was 28-24, exactly what Oliver had predicted, down to the last point. Our entire table erupted in disbelief. People from other tables came over to ask Oliver about his prediction, and someone even bought him drinks for the rest of the night. Oliver seemed just as shocked as everyone else. He kept saying he'd just been joking around and had no idea how he'd gotten it so precisely right. He said he'd made the prediction based on nothing more than a random feeling and hadn't expected it to be accurate at all. The story spread through our friend group pretty quickly. People who hadn't been there started asking Oliver to predict outcomes for games they were watching or events they cared about. He tried making more predictions over the following weeks, but they went back to being completely wrong, just like before. Yeah, some people thought maybe Oliver had inside information somehow, like he knew someone connected to the teams or had access to information that regular fans didn't have. But Oliver works in accounting and has no connections to professional sports beyond being a casual fan who watches games at sports bars. Others suggested that it was just an incredible coincidence, that if you make enough specific predictions, eventually one of them is bound to be right, just by pure chance. The odds of guessing the exact score were pretty low, but not impossible, especially if you factor in typical scoring patterns for football games. Oliver himself started getting a little spooked by the whole thing. He said he'd always made random predictions for fun, but having one come true so precisely made him wonder if there was something more going on. He started paying more attention to his intuitive feelings about future events, but nothing else panned out with the same accuracy. A few weeks later, he tried to recreate the experience by making another very specific prediction about a different game. He was confident that he could tap into whatever had made his first prediction so accurate. But the game ended with a completely different score, and Oliver went back to his usual pattern of entertaining but inaccurate forecasts. The whole experience made our friend group more superstitious about Oliver's predictions, even though, logically, we knew it was probably just a fluke. Whenever we watch games together now, people still ask him what he thinks the final score will be, just in case he has another moment of mysterious accuracy. Oliver has embraced his brief moment of psychic fame and still makes bold predictions about everything, but with the disclaimer that he's only been right once in his entire life. He says that one perfect prediction was enough excitement for him, and he's back to just enjoying games without the pressure of trying to see into the future. That story is over. One incredibly accurate prediction out of hundreds of wrong ones would be enough to make anyone question whether there's more to intuition than we understand. The fact that Oliver seemed as surprised as everyone else makes it even more mysterious. Sometimes the universe just decides to make things interesting. Let's move to a story about accidentally becoming part of someone else's big moment on a much more public scale. I accidentally photobombed a celebrity proposal. I was walking by and now I'm in the background of photos plastered across social media. I don't really follow celebrity news or keep up with who's dating whom in Hollywood, so I had no idea I was about to stumble into someone's very public romantic moment. I was just walking through Central Park on a Saturday afternoon, enjoying the nice weather and trying to get some exercise after spending the whole week stuck in my office. It was one of those perfect New York days where everyone seems to be outside, couples having picnics, families playing frisbee, street performers doing their thing, tourists taking photos of everything. I was walking along one of the main paths, listening to a podcast and not really paying attention to what was happening around me. I noticed there seemed to be some kind of commotion near the Bethesda fountain area. More people than usual were gathered around with phones out, and there were a few guys with professional-looking cameras positioned at different angles. I figured maybe there was a street performance or someone was filming a commercial or music video. As I got closer, I could see there was a couple in the centre of all the attention. The woman had her back to me, but I could see the man was down on one knee, clearly in the middle of a proposal. The crowd around them was trying to give them space while also recording the moment, which is pretty typical for New York, where everyone wants to capture anything interesting that happens. I wasn't trying to intrude on their moment, but the path I was on led directly past where they were standing. I could have taken a longer route around them, but honestly, I was kind of curious about what was happening. Public proposals always have this energy that draws people in, and I figured I'd just walk by quietly and continue on my way. As I was passing behind them, the woman must have said yes because she threw her arms around the guy, and everyone started cheering and clapping. It was actually a really sweet moment, and even though I didn't know these people, I felt happy for them. There's something infectious about witnessing genuine joy and celebration. I kept walking and didn't think much more about it until my friend Chloe texted me about 3 hours later, asking if I'd been in Central Park that afternoon. She'd seen a photo on Instagram that looked like it might be me in the background. I told her, yeah, I'd been walking through the park, but I didn't know what photo she was talking about. She sent me a screenshot of this Instagram post that had already gotten thousands of likes and hundreds of comments. It was a photo of the proposal I'd walked past, taken from the front angle, showing the couple embracing while surrounded by onlookers. And there I was, clearly visible in the background, looking directly at the camera with this expression of mild interest. The caption on the post explained that this was some actor from a popular TV show proposing to his girlfriend, who was apparently also famous for something I'd never heard of. The comments were full of congratulations and heart emojis, but there were also people asking about the guy in the blue shirt who was photobombing their romantic moment. Over the next few hours, the photo started showing up everywhere. Entertainment websites picked it up, celebrity gossip accounts reposted it, and it even made it onto some morning shows as a feel-good segment about love in the city. In every single version of the photo, I was prominently displayed in the background, looking like I was posing for the camera. The worst part was that I wasn't even looking at the couple in the photo. I had turned toward the camera because I'd heard someone calling out directions to the photographer, and I was curious about what kind of professional setup they had going. So in the photo, it looks like I deliberately positioned myself to be part of their moment. My social media started blowing up, with people tagging me in reposts of the photo. Friends from college, co-workers, even distant relatives were sending me messages asking if I knew I was famous for photobombing a celebrity proposal. Some people thought it was hilarious, others were asking if I'd done it on purpose. The celebrity couple seemed to have a good sense of humour about it. In an interview a few days later, they mentioned the friendly stranger who shared our special moment and said they thought having a random New Yorker in the background made the photo more authentic and representative of their relationship with the city. But the internet had different ideas. People started making memes out of the photo, photoshopping me into other famous romantic moments throughout history. Someone created a fake Twitter account for me called Professional Photobomber and started tweeting about my services for special events. A few local news stations even reached out asking if I wanted to do interviews about my accidental fame. One morning show wanted to bring me on to talk about the experience and maybe meet the celebrity couple in person. I declined because the whole thing was getting a little overwhelming and I just wanted it to blow over. The strangest part was walking around the city afterward and occasionally having people recognize me from the photo. Someone stopped me on the subway to ask if I was the proposal guy, and a barista at my usual coffee shop said she'd seen my face all over social media. It was weird being accidentally famous for something I'd had no control over. The celebrity couple ended up using a different photo for their official engagement announcement, one where I wasn't visible in the background. But the original photobomb picture still resurfaces on social media occasionally, usually when people are sharing stories about unexpected moments or funny coincidences. I've learned to laugh about it now, but for a few weeks there, I was genuinely worried that this random moment of being in the wrong place at the right time was going to follow me around forever. It definitely made me more aware of what's happening around me when I'm walking through crowded public spaces. That story's over. Accidentally becoming part of someone's engagement photos and having it go viral is definitely not something you can plan for. The fact that he looked like he was posing on purpose just made it even more memeable. Sometimes you stumble into internet fame in the most random ways. Our final story tonight takes us into the realm of academic mistaken identity that led to some very confused teachers. My brother wrote my name on all his school assignments. The teacher thought I was some kind of genius doing double work. My younger brother Nathan has always been the more academically gifted one in our family. He's 3 years younger than me, but he's been in advanced classes since elementary school and just has one of those brains that absorbs information effortlessly. I, on the other hand, have always been more of an average student who has to work pretty hard to maintain decent grades. We go to the same high school now, since I'm a senior and he's a freshman, but we're in completely different academic tracks. I'm in regular classes just trying to graduate and figure out what I want to do after high school, while Nathan is already taking sophomore and junior level courses and talking about college applications. About 2 months into the school year, I started getting these weird looks from teachers in the hallway. Not bad looks, more like impressed, curious looks from faculty members I'd never had classes with. A few times, teachers I didn't recognise would nod at me or smile like they knew me from somewhere. Then Mrs. Patterson, who teaches AP Literature, stopped me after lunch one day and said she wanted to talk to me about my recent essay submissions. I was completely confused because I wasn't taking AP Literature and had never turned in any assignments to her. When I told her that, she looked puzzled and said she had several papers with my name on them. She showed me a folder with 3 different essays, all with my full name written clearly at the top. The handwriting was definitely Nathan's, but the name was definitely mine. The essays were really good too, much better than anything I would have been able to write. They were analysing complex themes in books I'd never read, with sophisticated arguments and literary references I wouldn't have known. I realised what had happened immediately, but I wasn't sure how to explain it without getting Nathan in trouble. I told Mrs. Patterson that there must be some kind of mix-up and that I'd look into it. She said she was impressed by the quality of the work and hoped we could clear up the confusion soon. That afternoon I confronted Nathan about it. At first he tried to deny it, but when I described the essays Mrs. Patterson had shown me, he admitted that he'd been accidentally writing my name on his AP Literature assignments instead of his own name. He said he'd been so focused on the content of the essays that he'd been putting the wrong name at the top without thinking about it. But it wasn't just AP Literature. Over the next few days, I discovered that Nathan had been writing my name on assignments for 3 different classes. His AP History teacher had started wondering why a senior named after me was taking a class that was supposed to be for advanced juniors. His chemistry teacher was confused about having 2 students with the same last name but different first names on her roster. The weirdest part was that all of Nathan's teachers were really impressed by the work he was submitting under my name. Mrs. Patterson told me later that she'd been planning to recommend me for an academic scholarship based on the quality of those essays. The chemistry teacher had been wondering why such a talented student wasn't in more advanced science courses. Nathan explained that he'd been having trouble adjusting to high school and had been nervous about all his advanced classes. He said he'd been writing my name on assignments as a kind of security blanket. Like if the work wasn't good enough, at least it wouldn't be associated with his own academic record. He also admitted that he'd been comparing himself to me in a weird way. Even though he was clearly more academically advanced, he'd been feeling pressure to live up to what he perceived as my more confident, outgoing personality. Writing my name on his papers was his way of channeling what he thought was my self-assurance. We had to go to each of his teachers individually to explain the situation and get the names corrected on all his assignments. Most of them were understanding, especially once they realised that Nathan was actually in their classes and had been doing the work himself. A few were concerned about the mix-up and wanted to make sure there weren't any issues with academic integrity. The guidance counsellor got involved to make sure Nathan's grades were properly recorded under his own name and that there wouldn't be any complications with his transcript. She also suggested that Nathan might benefit from talking to someone about the adjustment stress he'd been experiencing. The whole situation actually ended up being good for Nathan in a weird way. His teachers now realised that having his work recognised under his own name actually gave him more confidence than his security blanket approach ever had. The teachers started acknowledging Nathan directly for his impressive work, and he began to feel more comfortable being the academically gifted freshman instead of trying to hide behind someone else's identity. By the end of the semester, Nathan was thriving in his advanced classes and had stopped second-guessing his abilities. He even joined the academic decathlon team and started tutoring other students in chemistry. The experience taught both of us something about the importance of owning your achievements, even when they feel scary or overwhelming. That story is over. The psychological complexity of a gifted kid using his older brother's name as a confidence shield is actually pretty heartbreaking. At least it ended with Nathan realising he deserved credit for his own brilliance. Sometimes the people we think have it all figured out are struggling with their own insecurities in ways we never expect. Speaking of unexpected discoveries, this next story takes us into the realm of workplace mysteries that make you question everything about your daily routine. I kept finding someone else's lunch in the office fridge with my name on it. After weeks of investigation, I discovered my coworker has the exact same name as me. I work at a mid-sized marketing firm where everyone brings their lunch and stores it in the communal refrigerator. It's one of those typical office setups where people label their containers with their names and hope nobody steals their food. For about 3 months, I'd been finding these elaborate homemade lunches in the fridge with my name written on masking tape. The handwriting wasn't mine, and the food definitely wasn't anything I'd brought from home. We're talking gourmet stuff. Homemade soups in mason jars, artisanal sandwiches with ingredients I can't even pronounce, perfectly portioned salads with fancy dressings on the side. At first, I thought someone was playing a prank on me, or maybe trying to be secretly nice by upgrading my usual peanut butter sandwich situation. But the lunches kept appearing consistently, always with my exact name written in the same careful handwriting. I started taking photos of them because the whole thing was so bizarre. I never ate any of the mystery lunches because taking someone else's food felt wrong, even if it had my name on it. Instead, I'd move them to a different shelf and eat my own sad sandwich, while wondering who was behind this elaborate meal preparation. The lunches were clearly made by someone who really knew their way around a kitchen and had time to plan elaborate meals. After about 2 weeks of this, I decided to stake out the break room during lunch prep time to see who was putting these gourmet meals in the fridge. I started taking my breaks at different times, trying to catch whoever was behind the mystery lunch situation. But I never saw anyone suspicious, just the usual co-workers heating up their leftovers and complaining about the microwave being dirty. The mystery deepened when I started noticing that the lunches would disappear by the end of each day. Someone was definitely eating them, which meant either the person making them was also the person eating them, or there was someone else involved who knew about the arrangement. I began to feel like I was living in some kind of office food conspiracy. I finally decided to leave a note next to one of the mystery lunches, asking whoever was making them to contact me. I figured maybe we could solve this confusion together and figure out why my name kept appearing on someone else's elaborate meal preparations. The note disappeared along with the lunch, but I never got any response. That's when I decided to get more systematic about my investigation. I started keeping a log of when the lunches appeared, what they contained, and when they disappeared. I also started asking coworkers if they'd noticed anything strange about the break room, or if anyone had mentioned anything about shared lunches or meal planning. Most people thought I was overthinking the situation, but my cubicle neighbour Priya suggested that maybe there was another employee with the same name as me. She said the company was big enough that it was possible for two people to have identical names without necessarily working closely together or even meeting. That possibility had never occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. I went to HR and asked if they could check whether there was another employee with my exact name. The HR representative seemed amused by my request, but agreed to look it up in the company directory. Sure enough, there was another person with my exact same first and last name working in the accounting department on a different floor. Same spelling, same everything. The HR person said it was unusual, but not unprecedented, especially in a company with several hundred employees. She offered to set up a meeting so we could sort out the lunch confusion. The other version of me turned out to be this incredibly organised person who meal prepped elaborate lunches every Sunday and had been wondering why someone kept moving her food around in the fridge. She'd been labelling everything with her name, just like I did, never realising that someone else in the building shared her identity. We both felt ridiculous for not figuring it out sooner, but also relieved to finally solve the mystery. She explained that she'd been getting increasingly frustrated about her lunches being relocated and had been considering filing a complaint about food theft. I apologised for moving her meals and explained that I'd been trying to be respectful by not eating food that wasn't mine. We decided to start including our department names, along with our names on lunch labels, to avoid future confusion. She also offered to share some of her meal prep recipes since I'd been so impressed by the quality of her cooking. Turns out having a name twin in the office isn't such a bad thing when they're an amazing cook who's willing to share culinary tips. That story is over. The dedication to investigating mysterious, gourmet lunches instead of just eating them shows impressive moral fibre. Finding out you have a name twin who's also a meal prep genius is honestly the best possible outcome to that mystery. Sometimes the most confusing situations have the simplest explanations. Our next story takes us into the world of mistaken digital identity and the chaos that ensues when technology gets confused about who you actually are. My phone kept autocorrecting my name to someone else's, and it led to some very awkward text conversations. I've had the same phone for about 2 years, and it had learned all my typing patterns and personal vocabulary pretty well. It knew my friends' names, my favourite restaurants, even the weird abbreviations I use when texting. So when it started auto-correcting my own name to something completely different, I was confused and annoyed. The name it kept changing mine to was Valentina, which is nothing like my actual name and not anyone I knew personally. Every time I'd try to sign a text message or introduce myself in a group chat, my phone would automatically change my name to Valentina without any warning. It was incredibly frustrating because I'd send messages and then realise afterward that people had no idea who was actually texting them. At first I thought it was just a glitch that would resolve itself after a few days. I tried manually correcting it several times and assumed the phone would learn that I didn't want my name changed to Valentina. But instead of learning from my corrections, the phone seemed to become more insistent about the name change. The situation got really awkward when I was texting with people who didn't know me very well. I'd introduce myself in group chats for work projects or social events, and my name would automatically change to Valentina. People would respond asking who Valentina was or whether I'd given them the wrong number. I started having to explain the autocorrect situation in every conversation, which made me sound either crazy or like I was lying about my identity. Some people thought I was using a fake name for some reason. Others thought I was confused about how to spell my own name. It was embarrassing and made simple text conversations unnecessarily complicated. The worst incident happened when I was texting my boss about a project deadline. I signed my message with what I thought was my actual name, but it auto-corrected to Valentina. My boss responded asking who Valentina was and whether this person was authorized to be discussing confidential work information. I had to call him directly to explain the technical malfunction. I tried everything I could think of to fix the problem. I cleared my phone's keyboard cache, reset the autocorrect dictionary, even did a full backup and restore of my phone's settings. Nothing worked. The phone remained convinced that my name was Valentina and continued making the change every single time I tried to type my actual name. Finally, I decided to take the phone to the store where I'd bought it to see if they could figure out what was causing the persistent autocorrect issue. The technician was initially skeptical that this was a real problem until I demonstrated it happening in real time. He watched as I typed my name and saw it immediately change to Valentina. He ran some diagnostic tests and discovered something interesting. Apparently, my phone had somehow synced with another device that belonged to someone named Valentina. The autocorrect dictionary had merged with hers and her name had taken priority over mine in the phone's learning algorithm. The technician explained that this sometimes happens when people accidentally connect to the wrong iCloud account or when devices get confused during software updates. Valentina's typing patterns and vocabulary had somehow become integrated with mine, and the phone was now treating her name as more legitimate than my actual name. To fix the problem, I had to completely reset my phone's keyboard settings and manually rebuild my personal dictionary. It was annoying to lose all the shortcuts and corrections I'd trained my phone to recognize over the past 2 years, but it was worth it to stop being called Valentina in every text message. The whole experience made me curious about the real Valentina, whose digital identity had somehow merged with mine. I wondered if she was having the opposite problem, with her phone auto-correcting her name to mine. I also wondered how many other people might be dealing with similar issues without realizing that their devices had gotten confused about basic information. I never found out who the real Valentina was or how our phones had gotten connected, but the problem disappeared completely after the reset. I was finally able to sign my text messages with my actual name again, and people stopped asking me about my mysterious identity changes. That story is over. Having your phone insist you're someone else for months is the kind of modern technological nightmare that feels both ridiculous and genuinely frustrating. The fact that some stranger named Valentina's digital identity got tangled up with yours through mysterious phone synchronization is honestly pretty unsettling. Makes you wonder how much of your digital life is actually under your control. Now let's dive into a story about an unexpected reunion that proves sometimes the internet can bring people together in the most surprising ways. I accidentally joined my high school bullies support group online, and we ended up helping each other heal. I'd been struggling with anxiety and depression for a few months, and decided to try online support groups as a way to connect with people who understood what I was going through. I found this group that met virtually every week, and the description said it was for people dealing with social anxiety and past trauma. The group was small, maybe 8 or 10 people, and everyone used first names, only Todd share our struggles, offer, maintain privacy. We support to each other and work through different coping strategies together. It felt safe and anonymous, which was exactly what I needed at the time. There was one person in the group who went by River, who always had really thoughtful responses to other people's problems. They'd share insights about dealing with shame and guilt, and they seemed to have a lot of experience working through issues related to how they'd treated people in the past. Their perspective was always really helpful, even though they never shared many details about their own situation. After about 6 weeks of participating in the group, River started opening up more about their background. They mentioned growing up in a specific area that sounded familiar, and they referenced some local landmarks and schools that I recognized from my own childhood. I started wondering if we might be from the same town. During one session, River was talking about feeling guilty about things they'd done in high school and how they'd been working to make amends for past behaviour. They mentioned attending the same high school I'd graduated from, and suddenly I had this sinking feeling about who River might actually be. I decided to test my suspicion by mentioning some specific details about our high school that only someone who'd actually attended there would know. River responded with even more specific information, including references to teachers and events that confirmed we'd been there at the same time. That's when I realised River was actually Cameron, someone who had made my high school experience absolutely miserable. Cameron had been part of a group that consistently bullied me for being quiet and different. They'd made jokes about my appearance, excluded me from social events, and generally made me feel invisible and worthless throughout most of my teenage years. I was shocked to discover that this person, who'd been offering me such thoughtful support and encouragement, was the same person who'd contributed to a lot of my self-esteem issues in the first place. I didn't know whether to confront them, leave the group, or pretend I hadn't figured out their identity. I decided to send River a private message, asking if they remembered me from high school. I used my real name and mentioned a few specific incidents that I knew they'd been involved in. I tried to keep the message neutral and non-accusatory, but I also wanted them to know that I knew who they were. River responded almost immediately with a long emotional message, acknowledging that they were indeed Cameron and that they'd been hoping for years to find a way to apologise to me. They said they'd recognised me early on in the support group, but hadn't known how to bring up our shared history without making me uncomfortable. Cameron explained that they'd been in therapy for several years, working through their own issues with depression and anxiety, and that a lot of their problems stemmed from the shame and guilt they felt about how they treated people in high school. They said bullying me and others had been their way of dealing with their own insecurities and family problems, but that they'd realised how much damage they'd caused. We ended up having several private conversations outside of the group sessions, and Cameron gave me a genuine, detailed apology for everything they'd done. They acknowledged the specific ways they'd hurt me and took full responsibility for their actions. They also shared some of their own struggles from that time period that I'd never known about. The weird thing was, those conversations ended up being really healing for both of us. I got the closure and acknowledgement I'd never thought I'd receive, and Cameron got to make amends in a way that felt meaningful and authentic. We both continued participating in the support group, and our interactions there became even more supportive and honest. Cameron and I aren't exactly friends now, but we've maintained a respectful connection based on our mutual growth and healing. They've continued working on themselves and have reached out to several other people from high school to make similar amends. Our accidental reunion in that support group ended up being exactly what both of us needed to move forward from that difficult period in our lives. That story is over. Finding out your most supportive online friend is actually your high school bully is like something out of a psychological thriller, but the fact that it led to genuine healing and closure is honestly beautiful. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are also struggling with their own pain, and finding that common ground years later can be incredibly powerful. Let's move to our final story of the night, one that involves a case of mistaken professional identity that spiraled into something much bigger. I accidentally became a wedding photographer for a day because someone thought I was their hired professional. I was walking through the botanical gardens last weekend with my camera, just taking some nature photos as a hobby. I'd gotten a new lens and wanted to test it out on some flowers and landscape shots. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, perfect lighting, and the gardens were full of interesting subjects to photograph. I was crouched down getting some close-up shots of these amazing orchids when I heard someone calling out, "There you are. We've been looking everywhere for you." I looked up to see this frantic-looking woman in an elaborate mother-of-the-bride dress rushing toward me with a small entourage of people in formal wear. Before I could say anything, she started explaining that the ceremony was starting in 20 minutes and that everyone was waiting for me to get into position. She was talking about shot lists and timeline requirements and asking if I had backup equipment ready. I tried to interrupt and explain that I wasn't whoever she thought I was, but she was too stressed to listen. The woman, who I later learned was named Patricia, grabbed my arm and started leading me toward a different section of the gardens where I could see a wedding ceremony set up. There were chairs arranged in rows, an archway decorated with flowers, and about 50 people milling around in formal attire. Everyone looked like they were ready to begin. I kept trying to explain that there had been a mistake, but Patricia was in full wedding coordinator mode and wasn't hearing anything I said. She introduced me to the bride and groom as the photographer and started pointing out family members she wanted me to make sure to capture during the ceremony. The bride, who seemed surprisingly calm given the chaos around her, asked me about my equipment and whether I had everything I needed for the reception shots. I showed her my camera and the one lens I'd brought for flower photography, and she seemed satisfied that I was prepared for the job. At that point, I realised I had a choice. I could continue insisting that I wasn't their hired photographer and potentially ruin their wedding day by leaving them without anyone to capture the ceremony, or I could go along with the mistake and try to do my best with the situation I'd accidentally stumbled into. I decided to help them out. I'd been doing photography as a serious hobby for several years and had taken some informal shots at friends' parties and family gatherings. I wasn't a professional wedding photographer, but I understood the basics of composition and had decent enough equipment to capture the important moments. The ceremony was actually really beautiful, and I found myself getting caught up in the emotion of the moment. I moved around quietly, taking candid shots of the couple, the families, and the guests during the vows and ring exchange. Everyone seemed happy with my presence, and nobody questioned my credentials or asked for additional equipment. After the ceremony, Patricia thanked me for being so flexible and professional, despite the last-minute confusion. That's when I learned that their original photographer had cancelled that morning due to a family emergency, and they'd been scrambling to find a replacement. When they saw me with my camera, they'd assumed I was the backup photographer they'd hurriedly hired. I explained the real situation to Patricia and the couple, expecting them to be upset about the mix-up, but instead, they were incredibly grateful that I'd stepped in to help when their day could have been ruined. They looked through some of the photos I'd taken on my camera's display screen and were genuinely impressed with the results. They insisted on paying me for my time and asked if I'd be willing to stay for the reception to capture a few more important moments. I agreed and ended up spending the entire evening photographing their celebration. The couple and their families were so welcoming and appreciative that it turned into one of the most enjoyable days I'd had in months. A week later, I sent them edited versions of all the photos I'd taken. They were thrilled with how everything turned out and said the images captured the joy and emotion of their day perfectly. They even asked if I'd be interested in photographing their friends' upcoming weddings, since several people at the reception had been impressed with my work. That accidental wedding gig ended up launching a side business for me. I started getting referrals from that couple and began booking weekend wedding photography jobs to supplement my regular income. I invested in better equipment and started studying professional wedding photography techniques to improve my skills. The original photographer who'd cancelled reached out to apologise and offer to mentor me as I transitioned into wedding photography professionally. They said it was rare for someone to step up in an emergency situation the way I had, and they wanted to help me succeed in the industry. Now, almost 6 months later, I'm booked for weddings most weekends, and I'm seriously considering making photography my full-time career. All because I was in the right place, at the right time, with a camera, and someone mistook me for a professional. Sometimes, the best opportunities come from the most unexpected circumstances. That story is over, Accidentally becoming a wedding photographer because of mistaken identity, and then discovering you're actually good at it, is like finding your calling through pure chance. The fact that one random act of kindness launched an entire career change just proves that sometimes the universe has better plans for you than you do for yourself. Well, that brings us to the end of tonight's collection of stories. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or just getting lost in the strange corners of human experience, I hope these tales reminded you that truth really is stranger than fiction, and that the most ordinary days can turn into the most extraordinary memories. And that's where we'll leave tonight's journey through the strange corners of the internet. From accidental engagements with professors to mysterious dream encounters with coworkers. These stories remind us that reality has a way of being more bizarre than anything we could make up. Whether these tales helped you wind down for the night or kept you wide awake, wondering about the people in your own life who might be living double lives, I hope they gave you that perfect mix of comfort and curiosity that makes for the best bedtime stories. The internet may be full of chaos, but it's also full of these incredible human moments that make us feel a little less alone in our own weird experiences. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight, exploring these unexpected connections and mysterious coincidences. Sweet dreams, and remember that tomorrow might just bring its own perfectly ordinary moment that turns into an extraordinary story worth sharing. Our next story comes from someone who learned that wedding season can be more confusing than you'd expect. I accidentally joined the wrong wedding reception and didn't realize until the speeches started. I'm Clara, and this happened about 3 months ago during what felt like the busiest wedding season of my life. My cousin Rachel was getting married on a Saturday in June, and I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. The venue was this beautiful garden estate about an hour outside the city, the kind of place with multiple event spaces and winding pathways between them. I'd gotten the invitation months earlier, but like an idiot, I'd lost the specific details about which pavilion the reception was being held in. I remembered it was the garden estate. I remembered the date and time, but the exact location on the property completely blanked. When I arrived, there were 3 different weddings happening that day. I could see groups of people in formal wear scattered across different areas of the grounds, but I figured I'd just follow the crowd that looked most familiar. I spotted a group of people around my age heading toward what looked like the main reception area, and I fell in step behind them. Everyone was dressed appropriately, the decorations looked lovely, and there was that general buzz of celebration in the air. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing server and started mingling. The weird thing was, I didn't recognize anyone. Not a single person. But I figured maybe Rachel had invited a lot of people I'd never met, college friends or co-workers or something. For about an hour, I made small talk with strangers, complimented the bride's dress to people who seemed to know her, and even signed the guest book. Everyone was friendly enough, though I did notice a few people giving me curious looks when I mentioned being Rachel's cousin. They'd get this slightly confused expression and then change the subject, but I didn't think much of it. The food was amazing, by the way. Past hors d'oeuvres, a beautiful buffet spread, the works. I was having a perfectly lovely time chatting with random guests about the weather and complimenting the venue. One woman even asked me how I knew the bride, and I said I was family. She nodded politely, but looked a bit puzzled. Then came the speeches. The maid of honour stood up first and she started talking about how she'd known Jennifer since college. Jennifer, not Rachel. I thought maybe I'd misheard, so I kept listening. But then the best man got up and started telling stories about the groom, Michael, and how he'd met Jennifer at their first job out of college. Still no mention of Rachel anywhere. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was at the wrong wedding. Completely wrong wedding. Jennifer and Michael were lovely people, I'm sure, but I had never met them in my life. I'd spent the last hour and a half eating their food, drinking their champagne, and signing their guest book as Rachel's cousin. I felt my face turn about 17 different shades of red. I tried to figure out what to do. Should I just quietly slip out during the speeches? Should I find someone and explain the situation? Should I stay and pretend I belonged there until I could make a graceful exit? The speeches were still going, so I was kind of trapped at my table, trying to look appropriately emotional during touching stories about people I'd never heard of. During a particularly heartfelt moment, when Jennifer's father was talking about watching his daughter grow up, I started looking around the room more carefully. Now that I knew I was in the wrong place, it was obvious that I didn't belong. The flowers were different colours than what Rachel had described. The music was different. Even the general vibe was different than what I'd expected from my cousin's wedding. When the speeches finally ended and people started getting up to mingle again, I saw my chance. I grabbed my purse and started making my way toward the exit, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But of course, that's when the mother of the bride appeared at my elbow, smiling warmly and asking if I was enjoying myself. I panicked and said something about needing to make a phone call, then basically speed walked toward the parking area. I spent about 10 minutes wandering around the grounds trying to find the actual wedding I was supposed to be at. Finally, I spotted a familiar face from my family near a different pavilion about a quarter mile away. Rachel's actual reception was in full swing, and nobody had even noticed I was missing yet. I slipped in, grabbed a drink, and pretended I'd been there the whole time. The funny thing is, Jennifer and Michael's wedding was actually really lovely. If I'd been invited, I would have had a great time. Their friends seemed nice, the music was good, and the food was definitely better than at Rachel's reception. I kept thinking about them for the rest of the night, wondering if anyone noticed that some random woman had crashed their celebration and then disappeared during the speeches. I never told Rachel what happened, and I definitely never told anyone at Jennifer and Michael's reception. As far as I know, they probably just think some enthusiastic wedding crasher really enjoyed their cocktail hour and then got emotional during the speeches and had to leave. Which honestly isn't that far from the truth. That story ends there. Honestly, that's such a perfectly awkward situation that could happen to literally anyone. The mental image of someone earnestly signing a guest book for people they've never met and then sitting through emotional speeches about strangers is just peak social anxiety material. At least she made a clean getaway before anyone figured it out. Our next story comes from someone whose friend took the concept of having an excuse to a whole new level. My friend pretended to have a twin brother for an entire year just to get out of social obligations. I'm Jonah, and I need to tell you about my friend Marcus, who pulled off one of the most elaborate lies I've ever witnessed. This happened during our sophomore year of college, and I still can't believe he managed to keep it up for as long as he did. Marcus was one of those people who genuinely enjoyed spending time with friends, but he also really valued his alone time. The problem was, he was terrible at saying no to social invitations. If someone asked him to hang out, he'd automatically say yes, even if he wasn't in the mood or had other plans. Then he'd spend the entire time wishing he was somewhere else, but feeling too guilty to leave early. This led to Marcus being constantly overbooked and exhausted from socialising, when what he really wanted was to stay home and recharge. He'd complain about it all the time, but whenever someone invited him somewhere, he'd cave and agree to go. It was like he physically couldn't disappoint people, even when it was making him miserable. That's when he came up with what he thought was a brilliant solution. He invented a twin brother named Martin. According to Marcus, Martin was his identical twin, who lived back home with their parents and occasionally came to visit for weekends or holidays. Martin was supposedly more outgoing and social than Marcus, but he was also the brother who needed Marcus to come home for family emergencies or important events. The beauty of the Martin excuse was that it made Marcus seem like a good, family-oriented guy instead of someone who just didn't want to hang out. Instead of saying, "I don't feel like going to your party," Marcus could say, "I'm so sorry, but my twin brother is visiting this weekend, and my parents really want us to spend time together." Who's going to argue with that? At first, Marcus used Martin sparingly, maybe once or twice a month when he really needed a break from socialising. He'd get an urgent text from Martin, or his mum would call saying Martin needed him to come home for something important. People would be disappointed, but they'd understand. Family comes first, right? But then Marcus started getting more creative with it. Martin became this elaborate character with his own personality, his own problems, his own life that frequently required Marcus's attention. Martin was going through a rough breakup and needed emotional support. Martin was starting a new job and needed help moving apartments. Martin was having health issues and needed Marcus to drive him to doctor's appointments. The more Marcus used the Martin excuse, the more detailed Martin's life became. Our friend group started feeling like we knew Martin personally, even though none of us had ever met him. We'd ask about Martin's job, his girlfriend, his hobbies. Marcus had to keep track of all these details and make sure his story stayed consistent. Marcus even went so far as to create social media accounts for Martin. He'd post photos that he claimed Martin had sent him, though looking back, they were probably just photos Marcus had taken of himself from different angles or in different lighting. He'd show us texts from Martin asking for advice or sharing updates about his life. The attention to detail was honestly impressive. The whole thing worked perfectly for months. Marcus was getting the alone time he needed without hurting anyone's feelings or seeming antisocial. He'd bow out of maybe one event per week, citing Martin-related obligations, and spend that time reading or playing video games or just doing nothing. His stress levels went down, and he seemed much happier overall. But like most elaborate lies, it eventually started to unravel. The first crack came when our mutual friend Sarah said she'd be in Marcus's hometown for a work conference and asked if she could meet Martin for coffee. Marcus panicked and said Martin was actually out of town that week, visiting their grandparents. Then Sarah mentioned it to Marcus's mum when she happened to run into her at the grocery store, and his mum had no idea what she was talking about. The second problem was that Marcus was starting to get genuinely attached to Martin as a character. He'd spend time thinking about what Martin would be doing, creating elaborate backstories for Martin's relationships and career. It was like he was living a parallel life through this fictional brother, and sometimes he seemed more invested in Martin's problems than his own. The final straw came during spring break, when a bunch of us were planning a trip together. Marcus said he couldn't go because Martin was getting married, and Marcus was the best man. We were all excited and asked to see photos from the wedding, maybe even crash the reception if it was local. Marcus realised he'd painted himself into a corner and would have to either produce an entire fake wedding or come clean about the whole thing. He chose to come clean, and honestly, we weren't even mad. We were more impressed by the sheer commitment he'd shown to maintaining this fictional person for almost a year. Marcus had created an entire human being, complete with relationships, career goals, and personal struggles, just to avoid telling people he didn't want to hang out sometimes. The funniest part was that after Marcus confessed, half our friend group admitted they'd suspected something was off about Martin. The photos never quite looked right, the stories were almost too dramatic, and Marcus always seemed to have perfect excuses at exactly the right moments. But nobody wanted to call him out on it because the excuses were always so thoughtful and family-oriented. Marcus did eventually learn to just say no to social invitations without creating elaborate fictional scenarios. Though I have to admit, sometimes, when one of us cancels plans last minute, we'll joke about what Martin is up to these days. As far as imaginary siblings go, Martin lived a pretty interesting life. That story comes to an end. The dedication it would take to maintain an entire fake person for a year, complete with social media accounts and a detailed backstory, is honestly kind of admirable in the most ridiculous way possible. Though I have to wonder what would have happened if someone had actually shown up to that wedding. Let's move on to something that sounds like it came straight out of a glitch in the Matrix. I found a wallet with my same name inside, and it freaked me out more than it should have. This is Rosa, and I need to tell you about the weirdest coincidence that happened to me last month. I was walking home from work through downtown when I spotted a leather wallet sitting on the sidewalk near the bus stop. It was one of those expensive-looking ones, black with silver hardware, and it was just sitting there, like someone had dropped it and not noticed. My first instinct was to pick it up and see if there was any identification inside, so I could return it to whoever lost it. I've lost my wallet before, and I know how stressful it is, so I always try to help when I find someone else's. I opened it up, expecting to find some stranger's driver's license, and maybe figure out how to get in touch with them. But when I pulled out the ID, I nearly dropped the whole thing. The name on the license was Rosa Martinez. My name is Rosa Martinez. Same first name, same last name, spelled exactly the same way. For a second I thought maybe I'd somehow dropped my own wallet and was finding it, but I checked my purse and mine was still there. I looked more closely at the license. Different photo, obviously, but this other Rosa Martinez lived about 3 neighborhoods over from me. She was 2 years older than me, had dark hair like mine, and here's where it gets really weird. Her birthday was the same month and day as mine. Same month, same day, different year. We were both born on September 15th. The wallet had credit cards, a gym membership, grocery store loyalty cards, all the normal stuff you'd expect. But seeing my name printed on all of those cards, belonging to someone else, was genuinely unsettling. Like looking at an alternate version of your own life. This other Rosa went to a different gym than me, shopped at different stores, had different credit cards, but our names were identical. I started imagining what this other Rosa was like. Did people ever mix up our mail? Had we ever been in the same place at the same time without knowing it? Did we have friends in common who'd mentioned one of us to the other? The whole thing felt like some kind of glitch in the universe. I decided I needed to return the wallet as quickly as possible, partly because it was the right thing to do, but mostly because holding on to it was making me feel strange. I looked up Rosa Martinez in the phone directory online, but there were dozens of listings. I tried the address on her license, but when I called, it went straight to voicemail with a generic greeting. Finally, I decided to just take the wallet to the police station and let them handle it. But on my way there, I stopped by the coffee shop near where I'd found it, thinking maybe she'd been there earlier, and someone behind the counter might recognize her. I showed the barista the ID and asked if she'd seen this person recently. The barista looked at the photo, then looked at me, then looked back at the photo with this confused expression. She said, "Wait, is this some kind of joke? This looks like you, but with different hair." I explained the whole situation, and she seemed as bewildered as I was. She said she'd never seen the other Rosa before, but the resemblance between us in the photos was kind of uncanny. I left my contact information with the coffee shop in case the other Rosa came looking for her wallet, then headed to the police station. The officer who took the report seemed amused by the coincidence, but said it happened more often than people think, especially with common names. He said they'd try to contact her and get the wallet back to her. 2 days later, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "Hi, is this Rosa Martinez?" I said yes, and she said, "This is also Rosa Martinez. I think you found my wallet." We both started laughing because the whole situation was so bizarre. We decided to meet up at a neutral location to exchange the wallet, partly because I was curious to meet my name twin, and partly because I wanted to see if we looked as similar as the barista had suggested. We met at a park near both our neighborhoods, and when I saw her walking toward me, it was like looking at a slightly different version of myself. We had the same height, similar build, similar hair color and style. Not identical, but definitely similar enough that people might mistake us for sisters or cousins. We compared birthdays and confirmed we were both September 15th babies, just 2 years apart. We even discovered we'd both gone to the same university, just at different times. The other Rosa was really grateful to get her wallet back, and we ended up talking for almost an hour about the coincidences. She said she'd been wondering her whole life if there was another Rosa Martinez in the city, and now she finally had her answer. We exchanged numbers and said we'd stay in touch, though I'm not sure either of us knew exactly what to do with this connection. The weirdest part is that ever since meeting her, I keep noticing things that might be mix-ups from our shared name. Mail that seems like it might be for her, phone calls asking for Rosa Martinez about things I've never signed up for. It's like becoming aware of this other person with my name has made me more conscious of all the ways our identities might overlap in the world. We've texted a few times since then, usually when one of us gets mail or calls that seem like they might be meant for the other Rosa. It's nice having someone who understands the weird experience of sharing a name and birthday with a stranger who lives in the same city. Though I have to admit, sometimes I wonder what other Rosa Martinez's might be out there. That story ends there. The odds of finding a wallet belonging to someone with your exact name and birthday have to be astronomical. It's like the universe decided to mess with someone in the most specific way possible. At least they got to solve the mystery and turn it into an actual friendship. Speaking of mistaken identities, this next story is about someone who accidentally created the most awkward romantic moment of their life. My partner thought I was proposing when I was just tying my shoe, and now everyone thinks we're engaged. I'm Theo, and I accidentally created the most embarrassing misunderstanding of my entire relationship. This happened 3 weeks ago, and I'm still trying to figure out how to fix it without making things worse. My girlfriend Lily and I had been dating for about 8 months, and things were going really well between us. We'd started talking about moving in together, meeting each other's families, all those relationship progression things. But we definitely hadn't gotten to the point of discussing marriage or engagement. At least I didn't think we had. We'd planned this nice dinner out at her favourite restaurant to celebrate her getting a promotion at work. It was one of those upscale places where they dim the lights and put candles on every table, the kind of atmosphere that's supposed to be romantic and intimate. We'd had a great meal, split a bottle of wine, and were just finishing dessert when disaster struck. I was feeling relaxed and happy, maybe a little tipsy from the wine, and I was telling Lily how proud I was of her new job. She was smiling and looked beautiful in the candlelight, and I was thinking about how lucky I was to be with someone so amazing. Just a really nice, warm moment between us. That's when I noticed my shoelace had come undone. It was one of those dress shoes with the long laces, and it had somehow worked itself completely loose during dinner. I could feel it flopping around under the table, and I was worried I might trip when we got up to leave, so I decided to quickly retie it before we asked for the check. Without really thinking about it, I pushed my chair back and dropped down on one knee next to our table to reach my shoe. I was focused on the lace, trying to get it tied properly in the dim lighting, when I heard Lily gasp. When I looked up, she had her hands over her mouth, and her eyes were wide with shock. That's when I realised what this looked like. Me, down on one knee next to our romantic dinner table, looking up at my girlfriend after we'd been talking about our future together. From her perspective, and from the perspective of everyone else in the restaurant, it probably looked like I was about to propose. Before I could explain what I was actually doing, the people at the table next to us started clapping. Then the table next to them joined in. Within about 10 seconds, the entire restaurant was applauding and cheering, thinking they were witnessing a marriage proposal. Someone even started taking photos with their phone. Lily was still staring at me with this expression of complete shock, and I realised I was trapped. I couldn't just say, actually, I was tying my shoe, with the entire restaurant watching and expecting some kind of romantic gesture. But I also didn't have a ring, hadn't planned a proposal, and wasn't ready to get engaged. I was just trying to fix my shoelace, so I did the only thing I could think of in that moment. I grabbed Lily's hand, looked into her eyes and said, "Lily, you mean everything to me, and I can't imagine my life without you." Which was true, but also completely improvised, and not at all what I'd been planning to say while fixing my shoe. The restaurant erupted in even louder applause. Someone sent over a bottle of champagne from the bar. The server came over with a huge smile and congratulated us on our engagement. Lily was laughing and crying at the same time, and I was pretty sure I was having some kind of panic attack. We played along for the rest of the evening, because what else could we do? We accepted the congratulations from strangers, posed for photos that people wanted to take, and pretended like this had been planned all along. Lily kept looking at me with this bewildered but happy expression, like she couldn't believe what was happening but was going with it. When we finally got back to her apartment, we had the most awkward conversation of our entire relationship. I tried to explain that I'd just been tying my shoe, that I hadn't actually meant to propose, that I wasn't ready for that step yet. But Lily said that even though it started as an accident, what I'd said to her felt genuine, and maybe the universe was pushing us towards something we'd been avoiding. The problem is, Lily had already called her mum from the restaurant bathroom to share the news. Her mum called her sister. Her sister posted about it on social media. By the time we were having our "this was an accident" conversation, half her family already knew about our supposed engagement, and they were all so excited and happy for us. We've been in this weird limbo for 3 weeks now, where everyone thinks we're engaged, but we never actually decided to get engaged. Lily seems happy about it and keeps referring to me as her fiancé, which makes me feel like I'm lying to people when I don't correct her. But I also don't want to hurt her feelings or disappoint her family by explaining that our engagement started with a shoelace. I keep thinking I should probably just go buy a ring and make it official, since we're basically engaged already, whether I planned it or not. But I also feel like that's not how these things are supposed to work. You're supposed to decide together that you want to get married, not stumble into it because of a wardrobe malfunction and social pressure from strangers in a restaurant. The weirdest part is that I do want to marry Lily eventually. I love her. I can see a future with her, and the idea of being engaged doesn't scare me as much as I thought it would. It's just the way it happened that feels wrong, like we skipped over an important conversation and jumped straight to the end result. Lily keeps joking that she has the most unique engagement story ever, and that most people will never be able to top accidentally getting engaged because of a shoelace. She's not wrong about that. I just wish I could go back and do it properly, with intention and planning, and an actual ring. But I guess sometimes life pushes you toward decisions you weren't ready to make, and you just have to figure out how to make the best of it. We're looking at rings together this weekend, and I'm trying to think of this as the universe telling us we're ready for the next step, even if we didn't realize it ourselves. That story wraps up there. Imagine trying to explain to your future kids that Daddy proposed while tying his shoe, and Mommy said yes to an accident. Though honestly, it sounds like they were headed in that direction anyway, and just needed a push from fate, and a very supportive restaurant crowd. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that dog parks can be more confusing than you'd expect. I accidentally took someone else's dog home from the park and didn't realise until I tried to feed him dinner. This is Kai, and I need to tell you about the most embarrassing pet mix-up that somehow lasted an entire afternoon. I have a golden retriever named Buster, who's about 3 years old, and he's basically my best friend. We go to the same dog park every day after I get home from work, and it's become this nice routine for both of us. Buster is really social and loves playing with other dogs, so I usually let him off the leash to run around while I sit on one of the benches and read or scroll through my phone. The dog park is pretty big, with separate areas for large and small dogs, and there are usually a dozen or so dogs running around at any given time. Last Tuesday started like any other day. I brought Buster to the park around 5:30, unclipped his leash, and watched him immediately run off to find his friends. There were several other golden retrievers there that day, which isn't unusual since they're popular dogs in our neighbourhood. Buster started playing with a group of them near the far end of the park. I settled onto my usual bench with a book and kept one eye on the dogs while I read. Every few minutes, I'd look up to check on Buster, and I could see him running around with the other dogs, having a great time. Everything seemed completely normal. After about 45 minutes, I decided it was time to head home for dinner. I called out for Buster, and one of the golden retrievers near me immediately came running over. He looked exactly like Buster, same size, same colouring, same enthusiastic expression. I clipped the leash on without really paying attention, gave him a pat and started walking toward the exit. The dog followed along happily, tail wagging, acting completely normal. We walked the 6 blocks back to my apartment, and the dog seemed perfectly content the whole way. He stopped to sniff at the same spots Buster usually sniffs, walked at the same pace, even sat at crosswalks without being asked. I was thinking about what to make for dinner, and not really paying attention to anything unusual. When we got home, I filled up Buster's food bowl and set it down in the kitchen like I do every day. But instead of immediately diving in like Buster always does, this dog just stared at the bowl. He sniffed it, walked around it, looked up at me with this confused expression, and then wandered off to explore the apartment. That's when I started to notice things were off. This dog was interested in parts of my apartment that Buster never paid attention to. He spent several minutes examining the bookshelf, investigated the bathroom thoroughly, and seemed fascinated by the houseplants, which Buster has always ignored completely. I started looking at him more closely, and even though he looked almost identical to Buster, there were subtle differences. This dog's ears were slightly smaller, his tail had a different curl to it, and he had a small white patch on his chest that Buster doesn't have. This wasn't my dog. I had somehow brought home a complete stranger. I started panicking, thinking about some other dog owner who was probably at the park right now, frantically looking for their missing pet. I grabbed the leash and practically ran back to the dog park, hoping whoever owned this dog was still there and hadn't called the police or animal control or something. When I got back to the park, I could see a woman standing near the entrance, looking extremely stressed and calling out a name I couldn't quite hear. As I got closer, I realized she was calling for Rusty, and the dog I had with me immediately perked up and started pulling toward her. The reunion was both heartwarming and mortifying. Rusty ran to his owner like he'd been lost for days instead of just a couple of hours, and she was so relieved she started crying. I tried to explain what had happened, how I'd mistaken Rusty for my dog because they looked so similar, and she was actually really understanding about the whole thing. Turns out she'd been looking for Rusty for over an hour. She'd searched the entire park, asked other dog owners if they'd seen him, and was about to start calling veterinary offices to see if anyone had brought in a stray golden retriever. She'd been imagining all kinds of terrible scenarios about what might have happened to him. But here's the really awkward part. While I was talking to Rusty's owner and apologizing profusely for accidentally kidnapping her dog, I realized I still didn't know where Buster was. I'd been so focused on returning Rusty that I hadn't thought about the fact that my actual dog was still missing somewhere. We both started looking around the park and finally spotted Buster sitting calmly near the water fountain with an elderly man who'd apparently been waiting with him for someone to come back. The man said Buster had come over to him after all the other dogs had left, and he'd figured someone would eventually return looking for him. So essentially, I'd managed to lose my own dog and steal someone else's dog in the same trip to the park, without noticing either thing had happened. Rusty's owner thought it was hilarious once she knew her dog was safe, and the elderly man said it was the most entertainment he'd had at the park in months. Buster seemed completely unfazed by the whole experience. He greeted me like nothing unusual had happened, played with Rusty for a few more minutes, and then was ready to go home for his delayed dinner. I guess from his perspective, he'd just made a new friend and gotten to spend extra time at the park. Now I'm much more careful about actually looking at the dog before I clip the leash on. Rusty and Buster really do look remarkably similar, but once you know what to look for, the differences are obvious. I also learned that golden retriever owners are apparently very understanding about this kind of mix-up, because it happens more often than you'd think. Rusty's owner and I have become friends since then, and we often coordinate our park visits so the dogs can play together. Sometimes I joke that I accidentally stole her dog, and she jokes that I gave her the most stressful hour she'd had in years. But both dogs seem to have enjoyed their little adventure, even if their humans were completely clueless about what was happening. That story comes to an end right there. The fact that both dogs just went along with the whole mix-up like it was perfectly normal is probably the best part. Dogs really do live in the moment, unlike their anxious humans who spend an hour panicking over a simple case of mistaken identity. Let's move on to a story about someone whose family member took playing hooky to a whole new level. My cousin pretended to be sick to get out of school, then went viral on TikTok that same day. I'm Juliet, and I need to tell you about how my 16-year-old cousin Mia created the most spectacular backfire in the history of playing hooky. This happened about 2 months ago, and our entire family is still talking about it. Mia is one of those kids who's really smart, but also really lazy when it comes to things she doesn't want to do. She's always been good at getting out of responsibilities with creative excuses, and she'd perfected the art of the fake sick day by her sophomore year of high school. She had the whole routine down: slightly raspy voice, complaints about feeling dizzy, just enough symptoms to seem believable without being dramatic. On this particular Wednesday morning, Mia decided she wasn't in the mood for her chemistry test. She'd been putting off studying for weeks, and the night before she realised she was completely unprepared. So she went with her tried and true method: fake stomach flu. She spent about 10 minutes in the bathroom making realistic sick noises, then emerged looking appropriately pale and miserable. Her mum, my Aunt Linda, is usually pretty sceptical of Mia's sudden illnesses, especially when they coincide with important school events. But Mia really sold it this time. She barely touched her breakfast, kept holding her stomach and wincing, and even turned down her favourite cereal. Linda felt her forehead, asked the usual mum questions, and ultimately decided Mia was too sick for school. The plan was perfect. Mia would spend the day recovering in bed, maybe catch up on some Netflix, and return to school the next day, ready to take a makeup test with extra time to study. She'd used this strategy probably half a dozen times over the past 2 years, and it had never failed her. But here's where Mia made her crucial mistake. About 3 hours after her mum left for work, she was feeling pretty proud of herself and decided to celebrate her successful sick day by making a TikTok video. She'd been trying to grow her following for months, and she had this idea for a funny dance video using a trending audio clip. So Mia got dressed in her cutest outfit, did her hair and makeup, set up her phone, and spent the next hour filming herself doing this elaborate dance routine in her bedroom. The video turned out great. She looked amazing, the choreography was on point, and she was genuinely excited about how it came together. She posted it around noon with some hashtags about feeling good and loving life, then went back to her fake sick day activities. The video started getting views immediately, which was unusual for Mia's account. By 2 o'clock, it had hundreds of likes. By 3 o'clock, it was in the thousands. By the time school ended at 3:30, Mia's dance video had somehow caught the algorithm and was going viral. Mia was over the moon. This was exactly what she'd been hoping for with her TikTok account. The views kept climbing, comments were pouring in, and she was gaining followers by the minute. She spent the rest of the afternoon responding to comments and watching her numbers grow, completely forgetting about the context in which she'd made the video. The problem was, several of her classmates followed her on TikTok, and her chemistry teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had a daughter who was friends with Mia on social media. So while Mia was at home supposedly suffering from stomach flu, her extremely energetic and clearly healthy dance video was making its way around her entire school. Mrs. Rodriguez saw the video around 4 o'clock when her daughter showed it to her, laughing about how Mia was sick, but dancing better than most people do when they're healthy. Mrs. Rodriguez recognized Mia immediately and realized she'd been completely played by a 16-year-old's fake illness. When Mia's mum got home from work that evening, she found Mia still in bed, still maintaining the sick act. Mia asked for soup and crackers in a weak voice, complained about her stomach still hurting, and said she'd spent most of the day sleeping. Linda was actually feeling bad for her daughter and was planning to let her stay home another day if she wasn't feeling better. That's when Linda's phone rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez calling to discuss Mia's miraculous recovery. She very politely explained that she'd seen Mia's TikTok video, which had been posted during school hours, while Mia was supposedly too sick to attend class. She said the video showed remarkable energy and coordination for someone with stomach flu. The conversation between Linda and Mrs. Rodriguez was apparently very civil, but Linda was mortified. She'd been completely fooled by her daughter's performance, and now Mia's teacher knew it. Mrs. Rodriguez said She understood that teenagers sometimes need mental health days, but lying about being sick to avoid a test was a different matter entirely. When Linda confronted Mia about the video, Mia's first instinct was to claim she'd filmed it days earlier and just posted it that day. But the timestamp was visible, and some of the comments were responding to current events, so that excuse fell apart immediately. Then she tried to say she'd felt better briefly, and made the video during a moment of improved health, but Linda wasn't buying that either. The worst part was that by the time all this was happening, Mia's video had over 50,000 views and was still climbing. Her moment of viral fame was permanently associated with the day she faked being sick to skip school. The comments section had turned into a mix of people praising her dance moves and classmates roasting her for getting caught in such a public way. Mia ended up having to take the chemistry test the next day with no extra study time. Plus, she got detention for lying about being sick. But the real punishment was having to face her classmates, who'd all seen her viral video and knew exactly why she'd been absent. The whole thing became legendary at her school, and she's now known as the girl who got caught skipping school because her TikTok went viral. The video is still up, by the way. It has over 100,000 views now, and Mia gained several thousand followers from it. She says it was worth the detention because she finally got her viral moment, but I think she's learned to be more careful about the timing of her social media posts. That story ends there. The irony of going viral for the exact thing that exposed your lie is just peak teenage logic. Sometimes the universe has a very specific sense of humour about these things. Our next story comes from someone who had an unsettling hotel experience. I found a note under my hotel pillow that wasn't from the staff. I'm Elias, and this happened during a business trip to Portland about a month ago. I travel pretty frequently for work, and I've stayed in dozens of hotels over the years, so I'm used to the usual routine. Check in, get the key cards, find the room, dump my stuff, and try to get settled for the night. This particular hotel was one of those mid-range business places, nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable. I'd booked it online because it was close to my meetings and had good reviews. When I checked in around 8 in the evening, the desk clerk was friendly and professional, gave me the standard information about Wi-Fi and breakfast hours, and sent me up to the 4th floor. The room looked perfectly normal when I first walked in. Standard hotel layout, with a queen bed, desk, small sitting area, and a view of the parking lot. Everything was clean and properly made up, and there was the usual collection of hotel amenities and information packets on the desk. I unpacked my laptop, ordered some room service, and spent a couple hours reviewing materials for my meetings the next day. When I was ready for bed around 11, I pulled back the covers to get comfortable and noticed something white sticking out from under one of the pillows. At first, I thought it might be a mint or one of those turned-down service cards that some hotels leave, even though this place didn't seem fancy enough for that kind of thing. But when I pulled it out, it was a handwritten note on hotel stationery. Not typed, not printed, but actual handwriting in blue pen. The message was simple but weird. Hope you sleep well here too. Just that one sentence signed with the initials MK at the bottom. I stared at the note for a while, trying to figure out what it meant. The handwriting looked casual, like someone had written it quickly, without much thought. But the message itself was strange. Here too implied that this person knew I'd slept somewhere else recently, which didn't make sense if it was from hotel staff. And why would they leave a note under the pillow, instead of on the nightstand, like normal hotel communications? My first thought was that housekeeping had maybe left the note by mistake, intended for a different guest. But the more I looked at it, the more it seemed deliberately placed. It had been tucked under the pillow in a way that I'd only find it when I was getting into bed, not just casually sitting on top of the covers. I called down to the front desk to ask about it. The night clerk sounded confused when I described the note and said it definitely wasn't part of their standard service. He asked if I wanted to switch rooms, but honestly, I was too tired to deal with repacking and moving all my stuff. Plus, the note wasn't threatening or anything, just weird. I decided to ignore it and go to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about it as I was lying there. Who was MK? How did they know I'd slept somewhere else recently? Was this note meant for me specifically? Or was it just random? I kept imagining scenarios where someone had somehow tracked my travel schedule and was leaving notes in my hotel rooms, which was probably paranoid, but felt possible in the middle of the night. I finally fell asleep around 1 in the morning, but I had strange dreams about someone watching me sleep in various hotel rooms. When I woke up the next morning, the whole thing seemed less creepy and more just puzzling. I kept the note, thinking maybe I'd figure out what it meant later. My meetings went fine that day, and I didn't think about the note again until I was packing up that evening. I mentioned it to my colleague who'd also been at the conference, and she said she'd stayed at the same hotel chain in Chicago the week before. On a whim, I asked if she'd found anything unusual in her room. She got this strange look on her face and said she'd actually found a note under her pillow too. Same handwriting, same hotel stationery style, but the message was different. Hers had said, "Sweet dreams from your friend MK." She'd thrown it away, thinking it was some weird hotel gimmick, but now that I'd mentioned mine, she was starting to think it might be something else. We spent about an hour that evening trying to figure out if this was some kind of pattern. Were there other business travellers getting notes from MK? Was someone tracking people who stayed at certain hotel chains? Was this some elaborate marketing campaign that we were missing the point of? None of our theories really made sense. I ended up keeping my notes and started asking colleagues about their recent hotel experiences, but nobody else reported finding anything unusual. My colleague and I both stayed at different hotels for the rest of our business trips, partly out of caution and partly because the whole thing had gotten too weird to ignore. About 2 weeks later, I was telling this story to my brother, and he suggested I try Googling the initials MK along with the hotel chain name. I found a few news articles about a former employee named Martin Kovac who'd been fired from several hotels in that chain for inappropriate conduct. The articles were vague about what he'd actually done, but they mentioned that he'd had access to guest information and had been making unauthorized contact with customers. I called the hotel chain's corporate customer service line and reported both notes. The representative seemed to take it seriously and said they'd investigate, but I never heard back from them about what they found. I did get a voucher for a free night's stay, which felt like both an apology and an acknowledgement that something inappropriate had happened. I still have the note, and I still don't know exactly what MK's deal was or how many other people got similar messages, but I've definitely become more careful about checking hotel rooms thoroughly when I travel. And I always look under the pillows now, just in case someone else is leaving notes for travellers they've never met. That story ends there. The idea of someone tracking your hotel stays and leaving personalised notes is genuinely unsettling, especially when you're travelling alone for business. At least corporate took it seriously enough to investigate, even if they never shared what they found. Moving on to a story about online friendships that got a little too creative. My friend made an entire fake persona online and introduced me to them. I'm Ivy, and I need to tell you about the most elaborate catfishing situation I've ever been involved in, except I was the one being catfished by my own best friend. This happened over the course of about 6 months, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around why she thought this was a good idea. My friend Ashley and I had been close since college, and we talked online constantly, even though we lived in different cities. We'd text throughout the day, share memes, vent about work, all the normal best friend stuff. Ashley was going through a rough patch with her job and her dating life, and I was trying to be supportive, but sometimes she seemed lonely in a way that I couldn't really help with from across the country. About 8 months ago, Ashley started telling me about this person she'd met in an online community for people interested in vintage fashion. According to Ashley, this woman named Zoe lived in her city and had become a really good friend. Ashley would share screenshots of their conversations, tell me funny stories about things Zoe had said, and generally seemed excited to have found someone she connected with locally. At first, I was happy that Ashley had made a new friend. She'd been feeling isolated since her breakup, and it seemed like having someone to hang out with in person was exactly what she needed. Ashley would tell me about coffee dates with Zoe, shopping trips, movie nights, all the stuff that good friends do together. But then Ashley started suggesting that I should get to know Zoe too. She said Zoe was really funny and thought I'd like her sense of humour. Ashley gave Zoe my social media information, and soon I was getting friend requests and messages from this person I'd never met but heard so much about. Zoe and I started chatting online, and she was genuinely entertaining to talk to. She had opinions about books and movies, shared interesting articles, and seemed to have this quirky perspective on everyday situations that I found really engaging. We developed our own friendship separate from Ashley, texting regularly and even having long phone conversations sometimes. The weird thing was that Zoe and Ashley never seemed to be online at the same time. If Ashley was texting me, Zoe would be silent, and vice versa. I noticed this pattern but didn't think much of it at first. People have different schedules, and maybe they were hanging out in person when one of them wasn't online. But then I started noticing other coincidences. Zoe would mention things that sounded remarkably similar to stories Ashley had told me. They'd both recommend the same obscure books or movies within days of each other. They seemed to have identical opinions about really specific topics that most people wouldn't have strong feelings about. The thing that finally made me suspicious was when Zoe told me about a disastrous date she'd been on, describing it in detail that was almost identical to a story Ashley had told me weeks earlier. Same restaurant, same awkward conversation topics, same embarrassing ending. Either these two friends had incredibly similar dating experiences, or something else was going on. I started paying closer attention to the timing of their messages and the similarities in their writing styles. Zoe used some of the same unusual phrases that Ashley did, made the same types of typos, and had the same habit of sending multiple short messages instead of one long one. The more I looked for patterns, the more obvious it became that Zoe and Ashley were probably the same person. But I couldn't figure out why Ashley would create a fake friend and then introduce that fake friend to me. What was the point? Was she testing me somehow? Was she lonely and trying to create more social connections? Was this some kind of elaborate joke that I wasn't getting? I decided to test my theory by telling Ashley a made-up story about something embarrassing that had happened to me at work. I was very specific about the details and made sure it was the kind of story that would be memorable. 2 days later, Zoe brought up my embarrassing work story in conversation, asking how I was feeling about it and offering supportive advice. That confirmed it. There was no way Zoe would know about that story unless Ashley had told her, and Ashley wouldn't have shared something that personal about me with someone else without asking first. The only explanation was that Ashley and Zoe were the same person. I confronted Ashley about it over the phone, and she immediately started crying. She admitted that she'd made up Zoe because she was feeling so lonely and wanted to create more social interaction in her life. She said talking to me as Zoe felt different than talking to me as Ashley, like she could be a slightly different version of herself and see how I'd respond. Ashley said she'd never meant for it to go on so long, but once she'd created Zoe and I'd started liking her, she didn't know how to end it without disappointing me or making me feel stupid for being fooled. She'd kept up the charade for months, managing 2 separate personalities and trying to keep their stories consistent. The most confusing part was that I actually liked Zoe as a person. The conversations I'd had with her felt genuine and meaningful, even though she didn't exist. Ashley had essentially created a character that I'd developed a real friendship with, and now I had to process the fact that those conversations had been with my best friend pretending to be someone else. We're still friends, but things are definitely different now. Ashley got therapy to work through whatever was going on that made her think creating a fake person was a good solution to loneliness. And I've had to accept that my friend is apparently capable of maintaining an elaborate deception for months, while looking me in the eye and acting completely normal. The weirdest part is that I sometimes miss talking to Zoe, even though I know she was never real. Ashley and I have talked about this, and she says some of the things she shared as Zoe were thoughts and feelings she couldn't express as herself. In a weird way, Zoe was a real part of Ashley's personality, just not a real person. That story comes to an end. Creating an entire fake friend to have more social interaction is such a uniquely modern form of loneliness. The fact that the fake friendship felt real, even after learning the truth, just makes the whole situation more complicated and sad. Let's move to a story about workplace communication gone horribly wrong. I accidentally texted my boss instead of my crush, and now everything is awkward. I'm Samir, and I created the most mortifying workplace situation of my career with one misplaced text message. This happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm still avoiding eye contact during meetings. I'd been working at this marketing agency for about 8 months, and I'd developed a pretty serious crush on someone who works in the graphic design department. Her name is Alex, and she's smart, funny, and has this amazing smile that makes me forget what I was talking about whenever she walks past my desk. We'd been having more conversations lately, and I was finally working up the courage to ask her out. My boss, Mr. Rodriguez, is a nice enough guy, but he's very professional and keeps pretty strict boundaries between work and personal life. He's probably in his 50s, married with kids, and definitely not the kind of person you have casual conversations with about your dating life. Our text exchanges are usually limited to work-related questions and scheduling changes. Last Friday afternoon, I'd spent most of the day thinking about Alex and trying to figure out the perfect way to ask her if she wanted to get dinner sometime. I crafted this message that I thought struck the right balance between confident and casual. Hey, I've been thinking about you all day. Want to grab dinner this weekend? I know this great little place that I think you'd love. I was feeling pretty good about the message. It was flirty without being too aggressive, showed that I'd put thought into where we might go, and gave her an easy way to say yes or no. I spent probably 20 minutes perfecting the wording, making sure it sounded natural and not too rehearsed. That's where everything went wrong. I scrolled through my contacts to find Alex's name, but apparently I scrolled too far and accidentally selected Mr. Rodriguez instead. I didn't notice the mistake because I was too focused on making sure the message sounded right. I hit send, put my phone away, and went back to work feeling proud of myself for finally taking action. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a response. I was expecting either an enthusiastic yes from Alex or maybe a polite decline. But what I got instead was a message from my boss saying, "Samir, this seems like a personal message meant for someone else. We should probably discuss this on Monday." My heart stopped. I looked at my phone more carefully and realized what had happened. My romantic, flirty message asking someone out for dinner had gone to my middle-aged, professional boss instead of the woman I was interested in. I wanted to disappear into the floor. I immediately sent a follow-up text trying to explain. "Mr. Rodriguez, I am so sorry. That message was definitely meant for someone else. This is incredibly embarrassing and unprofessional, and I apologize for involving you in my personal life." His response was just, "We'll talk Monday," which somehow felt worse than if he'd been angry or made jokes about it. The professional, measured response made it clear that this was going to be an official conversation, not just an awkward moment we could laugh off. I spent the entire weekend anxious about what was going to happen. Would he think I was unprofessional? Would this affect my performance reviews? Would he tell other people in the office about my embarrassing mistake? I kept imagining walking into work on Monday and having everyone know that I'd accidentally sent a flirty text to my boss. When Monday came, Mr. Rodriguez asked me to come into his office first thing in the morning. I was prepared for a lecture about maintaining professional boundaries and keeping personal communications separate from work contacts. But the conversation was actually much more awkward than I'd expected. He started by saying he understood that these things happen, that technology makes it easy to send messages to the wrong person, and that he appreciated my immediate apology. But then he said he felt obligated to make sure I understood the importance of maintaining appropriate workplace relationships and being careful about how personal matters might affect the professional environment. The most mortifying part was when he asked if the message had been intended for someone in the office. I had to admit that yes, it was meant for Alex from the design department, which meant he now knew about my workplace crush. He nodded thoughtfully and said he hoped I would handle any personal relationships with co-workers in a mature and professional manner. Then he said something that made the whole situation infinitely worse. For what it's worth, Samir, that restaurant you mentioned in your message really is excellent. My wife and I had our anniversary dinner there last year. The fact that my boss had actually read and processed the content of my flirty text message was somehow more embarrassing than sending it to him in the first place. The conversation ended with him reminding me to double-check my contacts before sending personal messages and assuring me that this wouldn't go in my file or affect my job performance as long as it didn't happen again. He was actually very understanding about the whole thing, but I still felt like I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The worst part is that I still haven't asked Alex out. After the mortification of accidentally involving my boss in my dating life, I lost all confidence about the whole situation. Every time I see her now, I think about how my boss knows I have a crush on her, which makes me feel weird and self-conscious. And every interaction with Mr. Rodriguez is now tinged with the knowledge that he's seen me at my most romantically vulnerable. He's been completely professional about it, but I catch him giving me these slightly amused looks sometimes, like he's remembering my accidental confession about thinking about someone all day. I've been much more careful about checking my contacts before sending any personal messages, and I've decided that if I ever do work up the courage to ask Alex out, I'm going to do it in person instead of over text. Some conversations are too important to risk sending to the wrong person. That story ends right there. The second-hand embarrassment is real with that one. There's something uniquely horrifying about your boss knowing the exact wording of your flirty texts, especially when they respond with restaurant recommendations. Our next tale involves family members with questionable ethics when it comes to contests. My brother entered a contest using my name, and I won. I'm Leah, and I need to tell you about how my younger brother managed to both help me and completely annoy me at the same time. This happened about 6 weeks ago, and I'm still not sure whether to thank him or strangle him. My brother Ryan is 23 and has this habit of entering every contest he sees online. He's one of those people who thinks he's going to win big someday if he just submits enough entries. Sweepstakes, giveaways, random drawings. If there's a prize involved, Ryan has probably entered. He's never won anything significant, but that doesn't stop him from trying. The problem is, Ryan doesn't always use his own information when he enters these contests. Sometimes he uses fake names, sometimes he uses our parents' information, and apparently, sometimes he uses mine. I had no idea he'd been doing this until a package showed up at my apartment, with my name on it from a company I'd never heard of. Inside the package was a brand new laptop, one of those expensive gaming models that costs more than I make in 2 months. There was a congratulations letter explaining that I'd won their monthly tech giveaway, complete with specifications for this incredible computer that I definitely had not entered to win. My first thought was that there had been some kind of mistake. Maybe someone with my name had won, and the package got delivered to the wrong address. But the letter had my full name, my correct address, and even referenced the email address I use for online accounts. Someone had definitely entered this contest using my actual information. I called the company to explain that there must have been an error, that I hadn't entered any contest, and they should probably send the laptop to whoever actually won. The customer service representative seemed confused and asked me to verify my personal information, which I did. She confirmed that I was indeed the winner and that the entry had been submitted from an IP address registered to my apartment building. That's when I realised what had happened. I called Ryan immediately and asked if he knew anything about a laptop contest. There was this long pause before he started laughing and said, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that one. I used your name because I figured you had better luck than me." I was simultaneously grateful and furious. On one hand, I now owned an amazing laptop that I never could have afforded on my own. On the other hand, my brother had been using my personal information to enter contests without asking permission, which felt like a violation of privacy, even if it had worked out in my favour. Ryan's explanation was that he'd entered dozens of contests using my name over the past year because he thought I deserved to win something nice. He said he'd been careful to only use contests from legitimate companies, and he'd planned to surprise me if I ever won anything. He genuinely thought he was doing something nice for me. But here's where it gets complicated. Ryan immediately started acting like the laptop belonged to him, since he'd been the one to enter the contest. He kept saying things like, "We won a laptop," and asking when he could borrow it to play games. He even suggested that we should share custody of it, since he'd done the work of finding and entering the contest. I told him absolutely not. If he wanted to enter contests using my name, then anything I won belonged to me. He couldn't take credit for the victory and then claim ownership of the prize. That seemed like basic logic to me, but Ryan argued that it was unfair since he'd been the one putting in effort to find good contests. We got into this ridiculous argument about contest ethics and whether the person who enters or the person whose name is used has rightful ownership of any prizes. Ryan kept insisting that he deserved at least partial credit, and I kept pointing out that he'd been identity borrowing without permission for months. The argument escalated when Ryan admitted that he'd also been entering contests using our parents' names, our sister's name, and even some of our cousins. He had this whole system worked out where he'd rotate through different family members' information to increase his odds of winning. He genuinely saw nothing wrong with this strategy. Our parents got involved when Ryan complained to them that I was being selfish with our laptop. Mum and Dad were not happy to learn that Ryan had been using everyone's personal information for his contest hobby. They made him promise to stop entering contests with other people's names and to ask permission before using anyone's information in the future. The whole situation created this weird family dynamic where everyone was simultaneously annoyed at Ryan for the identity borrowing, but also kind of grateful that his scheme had actually worked for once. My sister kept joking that she hoped Ryan had entered some good contests using her name too. I ended up keeping the laptop, obviously, since it was legally won using my information and delivered to my address. But I also felt bad that Ryan's one successful contest entry had benefited me instead of him. So I let him use it sometimes when he visits, though I made it clear that it belongs to me and he needs to ask before borrowing it. Ryan has continued entering contests, but now he only uses his own name and information. He says it's actually more satisfying to win something legitimately, even though his odds are lower without the multiple identity advantage. He hasn't won anything since the laptop incident, but he's still optimistic about his chances. The weird part is that I probably never would have entered that contest myself, even if I'd known about it. I'm not usually a contest entering person, and I would have assumed I'd never win anything anyway. Ryan's impulsive habit of entering everything actually led to something good happening, even if his methods were questionable. I still don't know how I feel about the whole thing. Part of me is grateful that Ryan's contest obsession finally paid off, even if it paid off for me instead of him. But I'm also uncomfortable knowing that he'd been using my information without permission for months. It makes me wonder what other accounts or entries might be out there with my name on them. That story ends there. The mental gymnastics required to justify identity borrowing as a family favour is honestly impressive. At least she got a free laptop out of her brother's questionable contest strategy, even if the ethics are definitely murky. Our next story comes from someone who became an accidental member of a stranger's family memories. I was photographed for a stranger's family portrait by mistake. I'm Celine, and I somehow became a permanent part of someone else's family photos without realising it until much later. This happened at a local park about a month ago, and I'm still trying to figure out if I should feel weird about it or just embrace the absurdity. I was having lunch by myself at this popular park downtown, sitting on a bench near the playground area and reading a book. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and the park was full of families having picnics, kids playing on the equipment, and people walking their dogs. Just a typical weekend scene that I enjoy being part of, even as a solo observer. About halfway through my sandwich, I noticed a large family group setting up what looked like a professional photo session near the gazebo area. There were maybe 15 or 20 people of various ages, from small kids to elderly grandparents, all dressed in coordinating colours. They had a photographer with actual equipment, not just someone with a phone, so this was clearly a planned family portrait session. The family was having some trouble getting everyone organised and positioned for the photos. Kids were running around, adults were trying to fix their hair, and the photographer was attempting to arrange everyone up by height while keeping the composition balanced. It looks like the kind of controlled chaos that happens whenever you try to get a large group to cooperate for pictures. I was watching this unfold while eating my lunch, mostly amused by how familiar the scene was. Every family has been through this exact experience, trying to get that perfect group shot where everyone is looking at the camera and smiling at the same time. It's harder than it looks, especially with children involved. That's when one of the women from the family started waving in my direction. At first, I looked around to see who she was signalling to, but there wasn't anyone else nearby. She kept waving and gesturing for me to come over, so I pointed at myself with a confused expression. She nodded enthusiastically and motioned for me to join them. I assumed she was asking me to take a photo of their group, which happens sometimes when families need someone to operate the camera, so everyone can be in the picture together. I figured the photographer needed a break, or they wanted some shots with a different angle. I walked over with my phone, ready to help them capture their family moment. But instead of handing me a camera, the woman grabbed my arm gently and started positioning me in their group formation. She was saying things like, "Perfect, you'll fit right here between Cousin Marie and Uncle Roberts." Before I could explain that I wasn't part of their family, I was standing in the back row of their group photo with my arms around two people I'd never met. The photographer started counting down from 3, and I didn't want to ruin their shot by stepping out or causing confusion right at the crucial moment. So I smiled and looked at the camera like everyone else, figuring I'd explain the mistake after they got their picture. The whole situation happened so quickly that I didn't have time to process what was occurring. After the first shot, the photographer suggested a few different poses and arrangements. The family kept including me in every setup, moving me to different positions and treating me like I'd always been part of their group. Various family members introduced themselves to me, asked how I'd been, and made small talk like we were relatives who hadn't seen each other in a while. I kept trying to find a polite moment to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that I was just a stranger who'd been eating lunch nearby. But everyone was so friendly and welcoming, and they seemed genuinely happy to have me there. Plus, the photographer was working efficiently, and I didn't want to interrupt his process by creating confusion. The photo session went on for about 20 minutes, with me participating in group shots, smaller family clusters, and even some individual photos where people posed with me like we were close relatives. The kids in the family seemed especially excited to have me there, asking me questions about my life and telling me about their school activities. By the end of the session, I felt like I actually knew some of these people. They were genuinely nice folks, and their warmth and inclusivity had made me feel welcome, even though I clearly didn't belong there. When the photographer finished, everyone started exchanging contact information and making plans for how to share the photos once they were ready. That's when I finally spoke up and explained that I thought there had been some confusion, that I wasn't actually part of their family and had just been eating lunch in the park when they'd waved me over. The reaction was a mix of embarrassment, laughter, and amazement that they'd accidentally adopted a stranger for their family photos. The woman who'd originally waved me over was mortified. She explained that they'd been expecting a cousin from out of town, who they hadn't seen in years, and when she saw me sitting alone near the gazebo, she'd assumed I was the missing family member. She'd thought I was being shy about joining the group, which is why she'd been so insistent about including me. The family found the whole situation hilarious once they understood what had happened. They kept saying I was obviously meant to be part of their family, since everything had worked out so naturally. The kids were disappointed to learn I wasn't actually their new cousin, and a few of the adults joked about adopting me officially. The photographer said he'd been wondering why I looked a little confused in some of the shots, but he'd assumed I was just camera shy. He offered to delete the photos with me in them, but the family insisted they wanted to keep them as a reminder of their accidental addition. They said it made their family portrait unique and would give them a great story to tell for years. 2 weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail with copies of all the family photos. There was a note from the grandmother thanking me for being such a good sport about the mix-up and inviting me to their annual barbecue if I wanted to make my membership in their family official. Looking at the photos, I have to admit we all look pretty natural together, like I'd been part of their group for years. I kept the photos because they're actually really nice, and it's funny to have professional family portraits with people I barely know. Sometimes I show them to friends and tell the story of how I accidentally became someone's long-lost cousin for 20 minutes. It's definitely the most wholesome case of mistaken identity I've ever experienced. That story comes to an end. Getting accidentally adopted into someone's family photos and then receiving copies in the mail is such a wonderfully bizarre form of human connection. Sometimes the best family moments happen with complete strangers. Moving on to a story about someone who had an unexpected passenger. I found a stranger sleeping in my car at the grocery store. I'm Owen, and I had one of the most confusing parking lot encounters of my life last Tuesday. I was coming out of the grocery store around 9 in the evening after a quick run for milk and cereal when I noticed something was off about my car. From a distance, it looked like there might be something on my back seat, but I couldn't tell what it was in the dim parking lot lighting. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't something, it was someone. There was a person curled up in my back seat, apparently fast asleep. And there you have it, a collection of life's most wonderfully weird moments that somehow make perfect sense when you're trying to drift off to sleep. These stories remind us that reality is often stranger and more amusing than anything we could make up, and that sometimes the most ordinary days can turn into the most extraordinary memories. Whether you're dealing with mistaken identities, family shenanigans, or just the general chaos of being human, at least you know you're not alone in experiencing life's beautiful absurdity. Sweet dreams, everyone. My first thought was that someone had broken into my car, but all the doors were locked and there was no sign of forced entry. The person appeared to be a woman in her 20s, wearing a hospital uniform, and she looked completely exhausted. I stood there for probably 5 full minutes trying to figure out what to do. I gently tapped on the window, and she woke up looking completely disoriented. When she saw me standing outside the car, she immediately started apologizing profusely and explaining that she was a nurse who'd just finished a double shift. She'd been so tired that she'd gotten into what she thought was her ride share, fallen asleep immediately, and somehow ended up in my backseat instead. Turns out her actual ride was parked 2 spaces over in an identical car, same make, model and colour. The driver had been looking for her for 20 minutes and was about to call the police when we figured out the mix-up. She was mortified, I was confused, and the rideshare driver was just relieved he hadn't lost a passenger. We all laughed about it afterward, and the nurse insisted on paying for my groceries to apologise for the scare. She said it was the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened to her, but honestly, after working 36 hours straight, I'm impressed she managed to find any car at all. That story wraps up our collection of perfectly imperfect human moments. From wedding crashes and imaginary twins to mistaken proposals and accidental kidnapping of golden retrievers, these tales remind us that life's most memorable experiences often come from our most awkward mistakes. Whether you're signing someone else's guest book, maintaining elaborate lies about fictional siblings, or accidentally becoming part of a stranger's family photos, these moments of beautiful chaos are what make us human. The common thread through all these stories is how our attempts to navigate everyday situations can spiral into something unexpectedly wonderful, or wonderfully embarrassing. Sometimes we end up exactly where we need to be, even when we started off completely lost. Other times we create problems we never knew were possible, like getting engaged while tying a shoe or going viral while playing hooky. What makes these stories perfect for falling asleep is that they remind us that tomorrow's disasters might just be next week's favourite memories. The stranger whose wallet you find might share your exact name and birthday. The dog you accidentally take home might become your pet's new best friend. The family that adopts you for their photos might send you copies in the mail with an invitation to their barbecue. Life is beautifully, absurdly unpredictable, and sometimes the best thing we can do is laugh at the chaos and appreciate the stories we'll have to tell later. Whether you're the person who accidentally joined the wrong wedding or the one who spent a year maintaining an imaginary twin brother, you're contributing to the grand comedy of human existence. So as you drift off tonight, remember that everyone around you is probably dealing with their own version of these wonderfully ridiculous situations. Someone somewhere is probably discovering they've been texting their boss instead of their crush, or realizing they've been caring for the wrong dog all afternoon, or trying to explain why they're in someone else's family Christmas card. Rest easy, knowing that tomorrow might bring its own perfectly imperfect moments, and that's exactly what makes life interesting. Sweet dreams, and may your own stories be just as beautifully chaotic as the ones you've heard tonight.